Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I'd been hiking all day, trying to reach a spot near the ridge I'd found on an old topo map. The trail had faded into nothing halfway up, leaving me following a faint game path through pines and scrub. By the time I pitched my tent, the sun had just dipped behind the western peaks, leaving a chill in the air and long shadows stretching over the rocky slope. I was alone, and I knew it. I liked it that way. No crowds, no noise, just the wind and the occasional bird calling from somewhere far below. After I set up camp, I cooked a quick dinner on the small backpacking stove and leaned back on my sleeping pad to watch the sky darken. Stars were starting to pop through, sharp and clear above the tree line. The mountain air was crisp, the kind that makes every breath feel full. I checked my compass before turning in, a habit more than anything. Pointed north, everything normal. Around midnight, I woke to a strange rustling outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. But then I realized my tent wasn't near a game trail. I unzipped the flap carefully, poked my head out, and the world felt different. The wind had died completely. There was no sound but my own breathing. I reached for my compass to check my orientation before stepping out. That's when it started spinning. Fast, erratic, like a needle caught in a magnetic storm. I froze, eyes wide, expecting it to settle in a moment. But it didn't. It whirled wildly, not just jittering around north, but looping, swinging back and forth. My stomach sank. I hadn't moved. Nothing in my surroundings had. I tried to recalibrate it, put it on the ground, held it at arm's length, but every time I checked, it spun. I looked up slowly, thinking maybe I was imagining things. That's when I saw it. A pale light, slow and steady, hovering in the notch between two peaks across the valley. It wasn't blinding, not like a spotlight or a flashlight, but soft and diffuse, almost misty. It moved almost imperceptibly, like it was suspended, barely shifting against the dark rock behind it. My first thought was a small campfire far down the ridge, but it didn't flicker like a flame, and it wasn't moving downhill like someone walking. It was just there. I reached for my camera, but when I looked back, it was gone. Just like that, no trace. No glow reflecting off the snow patches, no faint smoke, nothing. My compass was still spinning like crazy. I waved it around, but the needle didn't stop. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, something catching off a snowbank or a reflection from the valley floor, but nothing made sense. The forest below was dark, empty. I couldn't hear anything moving. I'd been careful setting up camp, keeping it high enough that I'd see anyone coming. Nothing. I lay back down in the tent, heart racing, but I couldn't sleep. Every so often I'd hear the soft thump of rocks shifting, wind brushing against distant branches, things that normally wouldn't bother me. My compass continued to spin intermittently whenever I touched it, as if the world itself was unsettled. By 2 a.m., I decided to hike down a little just to get a better look from a lower angle. I left the tent secured, flashlight in hand, and followed a faint game trail toward the valley floor. The air was unnaturally still, and I noticed small details I normally wouldn't. The way the shadows seemed longer than they should be, the way the trees ahead looked slightly warped like they were leaning toward the valley. My compass needle snapped back and forth wildly with every step. Halfway down, I paused on a flat rock to catch my breath, looking back at the notch between the peaks. The light was back, faint, hovering in the same place as before. I stared for what felt like forever. It drifted slightly, a barely noticeable slide to the left, then paused, almost tauntingly. My hands shook as I raised my flashlight to point at it, but the moment the beam hit the valley, the light blinked out. I stayed there, frozen, listening. Not even the usual night sounds, no crickets, no owls, just a dense silence that pressed against my ears. It was as if the world had been put on pause. My compass eventually slowed, then stopped, pointing somewhere between northeast and east. But I didn't trust it. I slid it back into my pack, deciding I needed to leave before I started imagining things worse than the truth. I hiked back to the tent slowly, flashlight cutting weak arcs through the darkness. When I got back, I double-checked all my gear, made sure nothing was disturbed, then lay down, trying to calm myself. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale glow hovering in the notch, unblinking, unmoving, indifferent. I kept imagining it drifting over the peaks, floating silently above the world. Morning came with its usual cold light filtering through the trees. The mountain looked normal, beautiful, quiet, mundane. I packed up, took one last glance at the notch, and the world was ordinary again. No light, no movement, no strange compass behavior. Everything was as it should be. I made it back to the trailhead, still uneasy, my backpack feeling heavier than it should. Driving down the winding mountain road later, I kept scanning the peaks, half expecting that pale light to appear again. It didn't. I got home, unpacked, and tried to convince myself it was a trick of exhaustion, maybe some leftover adrenaline playing with shadows and reflections. But I know what I saw, and I know what my compass did. Even now, when I look at a compass, I feel that disorientation creep back. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I see a faint, pale glow hovering just beyond the edges of the peaks I can see from my window. I don't chase it anymore. I don't camp near those ridges. But I remember it. The spinning compass, the still air, and that slow hovering light that didn't belong to this world, at least not in any way I understand. I had been jogging that trail for years. It's a loop through the old pine forest behind my apartment in Ashland, Oregon, and usually it's just me and the early morning fog rolling off the Willamette River. That morning, the air was thick, almost sticky with moisture, and visibility was down to maybe 15 or 20 feet. I had my headphones in, playlist on shuffle, and for the first mile, everything was normal. My feet crunching on damp leaves, the smell of wet earth, the faint hiss of tires from the distant road. About a mile in, I noticed something weird. A light, small and pale, flickering between the trunks. At first, I thought it was a reflection off something metallic, maybe a car headlight way off the main road. But then the light moved. Not like a firefly or a flashlight beam. It darted sideways, up and down, in angles that didn't make sense. I slowed, frowning, pulling out my earbuds. The trail curved ahead, and the fog made everything look deeper and closer at the same time. I squinted into the gray, trying to pick out shapes. The first light vanished behind a tree, then another appeared to the left, moving in a perfectly straight line, then a sudden shift upward, almost like it jumped through the branches. My heart started to pick up, not from running, but from that odd, uncanny feeling that something wasn't right. I stopped completely, hands on my knees, staring. More lights appeared, 3 now, then 4, moving in patterns that felt deliberate. One zigzagged between 2 pines, then paused midair for a split second before continuing in a perfect diagonal. Another circled a tree trunk, impossible geometry, and then vanished, only to reappear somewhere behind me. I whispered my own name, trying to convince myself I was seeing something normal. Maybe flashlights from another runner? But that made no sense. The trail was empty, and these lights didn't follow any path a human could. I looked behind me, fog twisting into shapes and shadows, but there was nothing, just gray. Then the lights synchronized. All 5 paused for a heartbeat in a straight line, floating in the fog, and then they vanished. All of them. Like someone had flicked a switch. No trail of light, no lingering glow, nothing, just fog and the sound of my own breathing, loud in my ears. I kept moving, slow at first, jogging again to make it seem normal. But the trail felt different. Normally I could hear small things, the trickle of a creek, leaves shifting, maybe a crow cawing in the distance. That morning, it was all gone. Nothing moved. My feet made more noise than I expected on the wet leaves, but there was no other sound. The silence was too complete. I checked my watch. I had been stopped for maybe 2 minutes, but it felt longer, like I'd been standing there for 10 or 15. Weird, because normally I have a precise sense of time while jogging. Halfway through the second loop, I noticed the fog had thickened even more, visibility down to barely 10 feet. That's when I started noticing faint glimmers at the edges of the trail. Not the same lights as before. These were smaller, almost pinpoints, moving like they were riding the fog itself. They weren't in straight lines, more like gentle arcs, drifting in ways that didn't make sense if they were physical objects. I slowed, watching one hover near a branch, then suddenly leap sideways to a tree 20 feet away. I froze again. My breathing got shallow. I reached for my phone, thinking I'd record, but the moment I pulled it out, the lights were gone. Not just the one I was watching, all of them. No trace, no movement, nothing but fog and empty trees. I started jogging again, faster this time, adrenaline making my legs pump. Every shadow looked like movement, every break in the fog a potential flash of light. I felt a gnawing sense of being watched, like eyes in the mist, but I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything. My headphones were still in, music off now, but the quiet was oppressive. Near the end of the trail, I stumbled over a root and fell, scraping my knee. When I sat up, leaning on my hands, the fog had thinned slightly, just enough to see the parking lot lights through the trees. Safe. Mundane. I checked my phone again. Battery okay, signal okay, nothing recorded. Nothing had been saved. By the time I got home, my shirt soaked with sweat despite the chill. I was shaking. I kept replaying the morning in my head, trying to rationalize. Fireflies, maybe, but not at this density, not moving the way they did, not vanishing like that. Flashlights from hikers? Impossible. That part of the trail barely sees anyone at this hour, and certainly not in the fog with no sound. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those lights weaving through the trees, moving in impossible patterns. I thought about checking the trail the next morning, maybe jogging back at dawn, but I didn't. I didn't want to see it again. I still think about that run. I can't explain it. I've jogged that trail countless times since, same fog, same early hour, and I haven't seen anything like it again. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in just right, I get that same prickling feeling along my spine, like something is just out of sight, waiting to move in ways that defy explanation. And I know I'll never stop wondering if the forest itself was quiet that day to let me see it, or if I just caught something that usually moves unnoticed, slipping past the boundaries of normal perception. Either way, I've learned to respect the fog and the trees, because whatever that was, it wasn't just me imagining things, and it wasn't something human. I was helping my dad clear out the leaves in the backyard when I first noticed it. It was one of those nights in late October where the air is crisp but not cold, the kind that makes the backyard feel strangely wide and empty. My little sister Emma was on the porch with her sketch pad, doodling whatever came to mind. Our wind chime, the one Dad had hung from the old maple tree, was swinging lightly, even though there wasn't a hint of breeze. At first, I figured maybe a car went past on the street and stirred up some wind, but the road was empty. No headlights, no engines, nothing. Still, the chime kept moving, swaying back and forth in perfect rhythm, like someone was pushing it with invisible fingers. "Why is it moving?" Emma asked, her voice small and a little hesitant. "I don't know," I said, walking closer. The metal pieces were catching the dim porch light and clinking softly. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded deliberate, mechanical in a weird way. That's when I noticed the glow. At first, it was faint, just a small pale pulse hovering above the trees behind our house. It was bluish-white, soft, almost like a distant streetlight diffused through fog. But there was no fog, and there were no streetlights back there. The pulse grew and shrank slowly in a steady rhythm, and the chime moved in perfect sync with it, back and forth, glinting each time the glow reached its brightest. Dad came out carrying a bag of leaves and stopped when he saw us staring. "Are you messing with the chime?" he asked, squinting. "No," I said quickly. "It's moving on its own. Look." He frowned, stepping closer. "That's weird. There's no wind." He glanced up at the trees, where the glow was still pulsing. For a second, I thought he might dismiss it as a trick of the light, but his face changed, eyes narrowing, lips pressed tight. We all just watched. The chime continued to swing in time with the pulse. Emma whispered, "It's like it's alive." I wanted to reach for my phone, but it felt off. Every time I tried to grab it from my pocket, my fingers hesitated, as if something in the air was telling me not to. When I finally did, the screen lit up normally, but the camera didn't pick up the glow. I aimed it, tapped the shutter a few times, and the photos were blank. Just dark trees. Nothing. The pulse started moving, not across the sky like it was floating, but shifting slightly left and right above the maple. The chime followed perfectly, never missing a beat. It felt like the entire backyard had been drawn into the rhythm of this light. My stomach tightened. It didn't feel threatening, more curious. like it was testing us or watching. Maybe it's a drone, Dad suggested, though his voice had that uncertain edge grown-ups get when they can't explain something. I shook my head. No drone that small would hover without sound, and it's matching the chime exactly. We stayed there for what felt like an hour, but I know it couldn't have been that long. Time felt wrong. The pulse changed intensity slightly, dimming for a few beats, then flaring again, and the chime responded without hesitation. Even Emma's hair on her arm seemed to twitch with the rhythm. Then something else happened. The faint hum started. Not loud, more like the sound your chest makes when it's empty and quiet, that low resonance you feel more than hear. It wasn't coming from the chime, the trees, or anything on the ground. It was above us, surrounding us, matching the pulse. I felt it vibrate through my feet, up my spine. Emma clutched my arm. Dad's face was pale. "Okay," he said finally. "I think we should go inside." We moved slowly, all of us, careful not to break the rhythm. The glow didn't vanish. It stayed, pulsing steadily, following us as we crossed the patio and the lawn. When we reached the back door, the hum stopped, as if someone had turned it off. The chime hung perfectly still, swaying only when the old maple branch twitched slightly. Inside, the lights felt bright and sharp, too normal. The radio was playing faint music from the living room speaker. Emma stayed close to me, glancing out the window every few seconds. Dad went to the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water, though he didn't touch it, just stared out the window. I kept my phone out trying to capture anything. The screen remained blank. Even in the photos, the backyard looked completely ordinary. No pulse, no glow, no hum. Over the next few days, we noticed small things. The wind chime would swing occasionally, even with no wind, though never with the same rhythm as that first night. Emma said she sometimes felt a faint vibration in her hands when she held it. I started checking the sky whenever I was in the backyard at dusk. Nothing. Just trees, stars, and the soft crash of the neighborhood settling into quiet. One night, a week later, I stepped out alone. The air was still, almost warm for November. The chime didn't move and the sky was empty. I leaned against the porch railing, thinking maybe it had been a trick of shadows or a weird electrical discharge from a storm that had passed unnoticed. Then, far above the trees, just a faint flicker, a pulse, a single beat, like a heartbeat in the sky. My chest tightened and the chime on the porch swung slightly, almost imperceptibly. I didn't run, didn't call anyone, just watched until the pulse faded. I still don't understand it. I don't know if it was a trick of light, a strange natural phenomenon, or something else entirely. The backyard is ordinary now. The chime hangs silently, the maple tree stands the same, and life goes on. But sometimes, especially when the wind dies down and the air is perfectly still, I feel that rhythm again. Faint, patient, waiting, maybe, for someone to notice. Even now, I check the sky every time I step out after dark. It's a habit, and I can't stop. Because whatever that was, it left something behind, a sense that the world isn't as empty as it seems, that there's something up there, watching, moving in ways we can barely perceive, and maybe, just maybe, it knows we're watching too. I was driving with Mia down the Pacific Coast Highway one evening in late September. The sky was heavy with cloud, the kind that hangs over the ocean and eats the color out of everything. The sun was gone, but there was still that grayish light that makes everything look unreal, like a photograph someone overexposed. I'd taken this route 100 times before, so I wasn't really paying attention to the road. Mia was in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone, headphones dangling, half listening to whatever playlist she'd started. Somewhere near Big Sur, I noticed the radio had gone weird. The station we'd been tuned to for most of the drive had just disappeared. Static filled the speakers, loud and crackling, the sort that makes your teeth vibrate. I fiddled with the dial, tried AM and FM, but every channel sounded the same, just static. "What the hell?" I muttered. Mia looked up from her phone. "Maybe the signal's bad," she said. "We're in the middle of nowhere. It's probably just a dead zone." I shrugged and turned the volume down, but then I noticed something odd. Beneath the static, there was this low hum. Just a faint vibration at first, like the sound of an idling engine, but deeper, smoother, almost musical in a way I couldn't place. It wasn't coming from the engine because the car was on cruise. It wasn't coming from the radio either, at least not entirely. It felt like it was moving with us, almost shadowing the car, louder when we sped up, softer when we slowed down. "Do you hear that?" I asked, turning slightly to look at her. Mia nodded, frowning. "Yeah, it's weird, kind of like a low note that never changes." We drove in silence for a while, watching the cliffs on the left drop into dark water, the fog rolling in from the ocean and curling around the road. The hum stayed with us, constant, patient. It made the air feel heavy, almost sticky. Every once in a while, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see some car behind us or maybe a maintenance truck, but the highway was empty. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a glimmer on the horizon, a light hovering above the water, pale and diffuse. It wasn't blinking like a boat or a lighthouse. It was steady, almost like it was suspended in the sky. My stomach turned over a bit. Something about the way it stayed in the same position as we moved felt wrong. Normally, lights along the coast move relative to the car, or they shrink as we drive past them. This one didn't. "Is that a helicopter?" Mia whispered. "I don't think so," I said, tightening my grip on the wheel. "I don't hear any rotors." The hum in the car seemed to deepen, almost synchronized with the light. It wasn't loud, never loud, but it had a presence, filling the cabin in a way that made it impossible to ignore. We slowed, creeping down the curves to see if we were imagining it. The light didn't flicker or shift. It just hung there, pale and distant. I tried to get a closer look by craning my neck out the window. The fog was thickening now, and the light seemed to dissolve into it, but I could still see it, just at the edge of vision, drifting slightly side to side as if it were adjusting its position to match ours. Mia reached over, touching my arm. "Maybe it's a drone?" she suggested, though her voice had that edge of doubt that made me not want to argue. "No drone that size, not out here," I muttered. The cliffs were empty, the road deserted, nothing but fog, ocean, and us. Then the hum changed. It didn't get louder or softer, it shifted, almost like it was aware of us. My stomach sank. I could feel it vibrating through the floor, the seats, even the steering wheel. I wanted to turn the radio off entirely, but when I did, the hum didn't stop. It seemed to emanate from around us, not inside the car. I glanced at Mia. She was pale, gripping the dashboard, eyes wide. The light ahead hadn't moved, and then, almost imperceptibly, it started to move with us, keeping pace despite the road curving and dropping. I slowed to a crawl, but the light mirrored us, maintaining the same distance, hanging in the fog. I tried my phone, thinking maybe I could take a picture. The flashlight app worked, the screen lit up, but the camera couldn't focus on the light at all. It just blurred like the fog was swallowing it. I took a few pictures anyway, hoping something might show up. When I looked at the images, all I saw was gray. No light, no shape. The road opened up onto a long, straight stretch along the cliffs. I forced myself to breathe, keeping the car steady. The light rose slightly, like it was drifting higher, and the hum became almost imperceptibly harmonic. It wasn't threatening, but it was otherworldly. I couldn't figure out how a single object, or whatever it was, could create a sound that moved with us, that seemed aware of our speed and direction. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. No flicker, no fade, no movement out of sight. 1 second it was there, just above the water, and the next, nothing. The static returned to the radio, heavier now, louder, but the hum was gone. No sound at all except the car and the tires on the asphalt. We didn't speak for a while, driving in silence. The fog thinned, the cliffs returned to their normal shape, and the ocean looked ordinary again. The radio slowly caught a signal. Some talk station, just static-laden voices. I wanted to convince myself I'd imagined it, that maybe the fog and the dying light had played tricks on me. But the way Mia kept glancing over her shoulder made me know she hadn't. By the time we reached Cambria, lights from houses and street lamps backlit the cliffs. The night was normal again, mundane, safe, but I couldn't shake the memory of that hum, the way the light moved with us, like it was tracking us. We stopped at a diner, ordered coffee, and I kept looking out the window, scanning the highway. Nothing. Just cars, the occasional dog walker, and the sea rolling under a silver sky. I didn't try the camera again. My phone showed nothing but the empty road. We drove home slowly, talking about everything but the light and the hum. I think we both knew that naming it or even discussing it in detail might make it more real. The thing is, I can't explain it. There was nothing tangible, nothing solid, just a light, a hum, and that creeping, impossible feeling of being accompanied by something entirely unexplainable. Even now, months later, whenever I drive that highway near dusk and the fog starts to roll in, I find myself listening. Not to the engine, not to the tires. I listen for the hum. And sometimes I swear I can feel it, just faintly, just for a second, like it's there again, moving with me, patient and impossible. I'd been hiking alone for most of the morning, taking the ridged trail up past where the switchbacks start to get steep. The air was thin and cold, even though the sun had just cleared the peaks, and I was grateful for the fleece under my jacket. I like hiking early because it's quiet. No crowds, no background noise, just the wind and the rocks and the distant cawing of crows. I paused on a ledge that jutted out over the valley, catching my breath and sipping water. From up there, the town looked tiny, just a scatter of rooftops and streets pinned between the hills. I rested my pack against a boulder, leaned on my trekking poles, and let my eyes wander over the canyon. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a shadow from a passing cloud, dark, diffuse, hovering just above the treetops. But the way it stayed in place, unmoving despite the light shifting as clouds drifted, made my stomach tighten. I squinted, trying to focus. The shape was vaguely humanoid, tall and thin, arms hanging, but it didn't move like a person. It didn't move at all, really. It just floated there, suspended above the valley floor, perfectly still. I blinked once, thinking maybe my eyes were tired, maybe the light was playing tricks. When I opened them again, the silhouette was gone, completely gone. No hint of it against the trees, no shadow, no blur. I shook my head, muttering, "What the hell was that?" That's when I noticed the birds. Usually at this hour, the valley is quiet. Maybe a few sparrows or crows. But now there were dozens of them, maybe more, circling low over the forest like something had disturbed them. And they weren't just flying, they were moving in tight patterns, weaving around each other, diving and ascending in a way that seemed deliberate. I've hiked enough to know how birds behave when startled, and this wasn't it. They weren't fleeing. They were circling, almost observing. I shifted my pack, trying to make a noise, figure out if the shape had returned. Nothing. The birds kept circling, and I felt my chest tighten. I've hiked alone for years, but suddenly I was aware of how isolated I really was. There wasn't a single other person within miles. No hikers, no planes, no distant traffic. Just me and whatever was, or had been, down there. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, though I didn't really expect to capture anything. The camera struggled with the sunlight and the shadows of the valley, and by the time I pointed it where I thought I'd seen the shape, it was blank. Not a blur, not a shadow, just trees. Nothing. I took a step back from the ledge, trying to tell myself I'd imagined it. The birds didn't leave. They kept circling, low and tight, like they were tied to some invisible anchor. Every instinct in me told me to go, to hike back down, but something kept me rooted. I wanted to understand, to see it again. Then I saw movement. A ripple in the treetops below, small at first like a gust of wind, and then the shadow again, but not exactly the same. This time, it wasn't a full humanoid shape. It was more abstract, a dark smear hovering above the canopy, as if the valley itself had lifted a section of shade into the air. And the birds didn't scatter. They split around it, curving perfectly to avoid it. I held my breath. I wanted to move closer, to climb down to get a better look, but something in my gut told me not to. It wasn't aggressive, not in the way a wild animal might be, but it carried a presence. Heavy, silent, intentional. I blinked again, and it vanished, like it had been erased from the valley entirely. The birds didn't leave, though. They kept circling. I sat down on the ledge, legs dangling over the edge, heart racing. I could feel the wind on my face, the sun warming my neck, but it was hard to focus on anything else. Time felt slower, stretched. I kept expecting the shape to reappear, but it never did. Only the birds, repeating the same patterns, turning over and over in the same tight loops. Eventually, I forced myself to stand and start heading back down. Every step felt deliberate, careful, because I was convinced whatever had been down there was aware of me. I kept glancing into the valley, expecting to see the shadow reform, or some subtle change in the trees, but it was empty, except for the birds, still circling, though now they seemed higher, less coordinated. When I reached the trailhead and got my phone out again, I checked the photos. Nothing unusual, just rocks, trees, and the faint haze of the morning sun. No shadows, no hovering shapes. The memory of it was vivid, though. I could still feel that weight in the air, the quiet hum of the valley when the shadow had been there, and the unbroken patterns of the birds below. On the drive home, I kept glancing out the window at the hills, half expecting to see it drifting above the tree line, but the sky was empty. Emma called me when I got in. She'd been at her art class and asked how the hike went. I told her it was fine. I didn't mention the shape, not right away. Later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I checked the valley from my bedroom window with binoculars, but there was nothing. Just the dark outline of trees, the silver glint of the creek, and the occasional flicker of a distant car. I've hiked that trail a dozen times since, sometimes at the same hour, sometimes in the same foggy morning light, and I've never seen it again. But sometimes when the valley is still and the birds start to gather low, I swear I feel that weight again, hovering just out of reach, waiting. And the birds, they never forget. Even now, I double-check the ledges, the treetops, the shadows whenever I'm out there. The memory hasn't faded. The shape may have disappeared, but its presence lingers like a quiet pulse in the valley that only you can sense if you stop and watch long enough. I can't explain it. I don't know what it was. I just know what I saw, and I know the birds didn't lie. Whatever it was, it exists somewhere out there, patient and silent, watching the world from above the trees. The night started like any other. I was at the security booth for a small industrial park on the outskirts of Colby, Missouri. Most of the warehouses were empty, and the big floodlights illuminated the asphalt like a ghost town. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and I'd been doing it for about a year. Usually, it was just me, my thermos of coffee, and the quiet hum of the night. Around 1:30 a.m., I noticed something odd on the cameras. I was scanning the lot near Building D, empty for months, and caught what looked like a shadow moving across the asphalt. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a cloud passing over the moon or a reflection off a puddle from last week's rain. The shadow was long, thin, and didn't move like a person. It glided, sliding silently from the far end of the lot toward the center. I flipped through all the cameras. Building D, C, nothing. Not a single feed showed movement, and the shadow I had just seen was nowhere on any of them. I checked the recording feature. There was nothing. It was like the shadow had existed only for the fraction of a second I'd noticed it. I rubbed my eyes and muttered, "Yeah, okay, maybe I'm seeing things." But the unease didn't go away. My stomach had that knot you get when something doesn't add up. I sipped my coffee, telling myself I'd imagined it, and went back to scanning the feeds. About 20 minutes later, I saw it again. Not on camera, not on any screen, but from the booth window, a flicker of movement near the edge of the lot. Long, dark shapes moving across the asphalt, gliding from one side to the other like a wind had picked them up. I froze. The shapes didn't make a sound, didn't raise dust, didn't even seem to reflect the light from the floodlights. Just shadows skimming the ground. I leaned forward, squinting. The cameras still showed nothing. Every single monitor. My heart started picking up pace. I called the other security guard. Well, he was supposed to be on the day shift, but still, I called the number just to have someone listen. No answer. Of course. I tried talking to myself out loud. It's nothing. It's just a weird shadow. You're tired. The caffeine is messing with you. I shook my head and got up to stretch. The lot was completely empty. My boots clicked against the concrete, and that sound alone felt loud, harsh in the stillness. Then I noticed the lights. Every floodlight in the lot blinked once, just a single pulse, like a stutter. And then they came back on, steady as before. I froze again, my eyes darting across the lot. Nothing had changed. No one was there, no car, nothing. Just asphalt and the faint outline of buildings against the sky. The shadows were gone. I went back to the monitors, double-checking. Every camera still showed nothing unusual. Not even the slightest distortion, not even the faintest flicker that might explain the shadows. It was clean, perfectly ordinary. I sat back down, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was a trick of the floodlights. Maybe my mind had been wandering too much. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move again. Faint, a blur along the edge of Building D. I turned my head fully, and it vanished, like it had been erased from the world in an instant. I decided to step outside. It felt reckless, stupid even, but I needed to see. The air was cold and dry, the kind of chill that makes the skin tighten. The lot stretched out before me, empty, illuminated by the steady yellow of the lights. I took a slow step forward. Nothing. Then the lights blinked. Just once. Almost like a warning, or maybe a signal. I stopped mid-step, staring around. When they came back on, everything looked exactly the still. Silent. Empty. My boots felt heavier, my chest tighter. I wanted to tell myself I was imagining it again, but something about the way that blink had happened, it didn't feel random. I walked to the far edge of the lot, near Building C, scanning every shadow, every patch of darkness. Nothing moved. No wind, no leaves, no rats, nothing. Yet, the memory of what I'd seen and not seen on any camera made my skin crawl. I went back inside the booth and sat down slowly. My coffee had gone cold. I tried turning the monitors off and on, checking every feed again. Still nothing. The lot was ordinary, completely ordinary, and yet, the memory of those long gliding shadows haunted the edges of my mind. Around 3 a.m., the regular silence returned. The lot was empty, the floodlights steady, my monitors perfectly blank. I made a sandwich to distract myself and tried to focus on the radio chatter from the town patrol, but even that sounded distant, muffled, unreal. I don't know how long I sat there just staring out the window, but the longer I did, the more I noticed the little things. The way the shadows seemed to stretch across the asphalt in my memory, the way the lights had blinked like a deliberate signal, and the odd calm that followed them. Everything normal, yet everything changed. By the time my shift ended, the sun was coming up over the trees. The lot looked perfectly mundane in the morning light, nothing at all like the strange place I'd experienced hours earlier. I locked up the booth, climbed into my car, and started the drive home, constantly glancing over my shoulder as though something invisible might be following. I got home and left my keys in the bowl by the door, sat down at the kitchen table, and just stared out the window at the street. Ordinary houses, parked cars, mailboxes, quiet morning sounds. And yet, that memory lingered. The shadows that didn't exist on cameras, the lights that blinked once in perfect unison, and the sense that the lot had been alive in some way I couldn't explain. I've worked that night shift plenty of times since, and nothing like it has happened again. No shadows, no flickering lights, no blurs at the edges of the lot, just the quiet hum of the floodlights, the hum of the town far off in the distance, and the empty asphalt stretching under the stars. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I see them. Long, thin shadows gliding across the lot, silent and deliberate, and I remember that one blink of the lights, like they were trying to tell me something I still don't understand. I left the bus a little later than usual that Friday night. The air was sticky for late summer, thick with the smell of freshly cut grass and exhaust from cars idling along Main Street. I had my backpack slung over one shoulder, earbuds in, music low, so I could hear the neighborhood around me. I usually walked home that way. It was a short cut, nothing too busy, just a stretch of cracked asphalt lined with old streetlights, some flickering from years of neglect. I noticed it about halfway down the block. The streetlights started flickering, one by one. Not all at once, like a power surge, but in sequence. As I walked, the first one would blink off, then the next, like some sort of slow, stuttering wave. My first thought was that the grid was acting up. We'd had storms earlier in the week, and these old lights weren't exactly reliable. But then I realized something. The flickering followed me. Every time I took a step, the lights would seem to react, blinking off in a pattern that matched my pace. I paused, took a step back, and watched. The light closest to me stayed on, the one ahead blinked off, and the next one farther up did the same, all in a staggered, perfect sequence. It was subtle, just enough that my brain couldn't quite convince me I wasn't imagining it. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was my imagination playing tricks with the half-light and shadows. I kept walking, faster this time, and the sequence picked up pace with me. The pattern made the road ahead seem like it was moving under a wave of darkness. My stomach tightened, but I figured maybe I was overthinking it. Halfway down the stretch, I heard something, a soft tapping, like fingernails against metal. I froze, looked around, but there was nothing. No one on the street, no cars, just me and the sequence of lights blinking along as I moved. The tapping stopped, then started again, faintly, irregular, somewhere behind me. I kept walking but started glancing over my shoulder. Nothing, just the empty sidewalk, the trees swaying in the light of my flickering companions. The shadows looked off, though, long, stretching in directions that didn't make sense with the streetlights still on. For a second, I thought I saw movement, something tall, dark, slipping between the trees. When I blinked, it was gone. I tried to speed up. The streetlights kept up with me. They flickered faster now, perfectly timed with my steps. It was like the whole block was alive, watching, reacting. I reached the corner where my street met Oak Avenue. Normally, the next few blocks had lights that stayed steady. Not tonight. They blinked, too, in sequence, as if the wave had followed me this far. I started feeling paranoid. My earbuds were dead, and the quiet had grown heavy. There was a strange hum, low, almost imperceptible under the normal nighttime sounds. Crickets, the faint rustle of leaves. It wasn't loud enough to be a car or a generator, just a constant vibration in the air that I couldn't ignore. I glanced down at my phone, checking the time, and the screen briefly flickered as if it had caught the rhythm of the streetlights. I tried to convince myself it was all random. Old wiring, maybe a transformer hiccup, but it didn't explain the way the pattern shifted as I slowed or the soft tapping that followed me for blocks. I passed a corner store with its neon sign flickering in rhythm with the streetlights, and I almost stopped. Something in the reflection on the window made me look twice. I thought I saw a figure standing far down the block, just out of the pool of light. When I blinked, it was gone. I took a deep breath, tried to relax, and started walking at a normal pace. The flickering continued, but it was slower now, almost gentle, like a wave rolling past me. Then, the low hum became more distinct. I could almost feel it vibrating through my chest. I stopped and crouched, thinking I could trace the sound, but it didn't come from anywhere obvious. No cars, no transformers, no animals. Just the empty street and the flickering lights above. I took out my phone and tried to record, hoping to capture something to show my friends later. The moment I pressed record, the lights blinked all at once and held steady. The tapping and hum vanished. It was unnerving. Nothing moved, nothing flickered, the street looked normal again, but the pattern had disappeared entirely. I kept the phone out, recording anyway, the red dot glowing, nothing but the quiet street in frame. I started walking again, trying to keep my nerves in check. Every shadow looked strange, stretched too long or too dark for the lampposts, and every rustle in the trees made me jump. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again, but it didn't return. The rest of the walk was uneventful, except that I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, not by a person, but by the same kind of presence that had been orchestrating the lights. I got to my house and locked the door behind me, breathing hard. My parents were asleep. The TV was off. I sat on the couch with the recording running, staring at the small screen. In the footage, nothing seemed unusual. The streetlights blinked once or twice before fading out of frame, and the tapping and hum weren't audible at all. It was just a normal night, empty and quiet. I tried to sleep, but kept thinking about the pattern, the rhythm of the flickers, the way the lights seemed to move along with me. I replayed the walk in my mind, over and over. Every time I did, I felt that same unease, the idea that something invisible was pacing me, nudging the world around me into strange, subtle rhythms I could barely perceive. The next morning, I walked to the bus stop with a friend, joking about seeing ghost streetlights or hearing things. My friend laughed and said maybe I needed more sleep. I didn't argue. I just kept quiet, thinking about how, even in daylight, the memory lingered. The street was ordinary, filled with the hum of cars and the light of the sun, but I knew something had shifted that night. Something I couldn't see now but had followed me home. I haven't walked that block at night since. I take the longer route, past the main road where the lights are consistent, predictable. But sometimes when I walk alone in the dark on a different street, I swear I can feel it again. The flicker of lights in sequence, the soft tapping echoing somewhere behind me, the low hum brushing my ears. And I wonder if I'd ever be lucky enough or unlucky enough to see it move again. I'd been fishing on the banks of Lake Sylvan plenty of times before, but never like that night. I had my little aluminum boat pulled up on the shore, tackle box open, lanterns swinging from the seat post. The air was crisp, almost biting, and the lake was perfectly still, the kind of quiet where you can hear every twig snap in the woods behind you. I was alone, except for the occasional call of a loon, and I liked it that way. Fishing at night was peaceful, meditative, the kind of thing that let you think without distraction. I'd been tossing my line for an hour or so when I noticed something odd. Ripples on the water. Not little ones from a breeze, not the fish coming up to the surface. These were large, circular, spreading out in smooth, concentric waves. I glanced around. The air was calm. The surface of the lake was flat everywhere else. No wind, no fish jumping, no ducks landing, nothing to make the water move like that. I rubbed my eyes and muttered, "Okay, weird, but maybe I'm just seeing things." I moved the lantern a little, casting its yellow light over the surface, but the ripples kept expanding, as if something invisible was moving just beneath the water. My stomach tightened, the kind of slow dread that creeps up without warning. Then I noticed the lights. At first, I thought they were stars reflecting on the water. Pale, almost white, hovering above the tree line on the far shore, but the reflection didn't match the light's movement. They weren't twinkling like stars, and they weren't static. They drifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifting their positions in a tight cluster. There were maybe 5 or 6 of them. The more I stared, the more I realized they weren't flickering like airplanes, and they weren't casting any light on the trees or water. Just these soft, pale points hovering above the woods. I wanted to tell myself it was a reflection or a trick of my lantern against the mist that had rolled in, but the air was still and the mist was minimal. The ripples on the lake didn't match the drifting of the lights either. My heart started picking up, a slow, insistent thrum, and I felt the boat shift slightly under me. I looked down. The water against the hull was perfectly calm except for the ripples that kept forming in that same strange, circular pattern. I leaned forward and tapped the water with my paddle. The ripples from the paddle spread out normally, intersecting the other ripples, but the concentric circles kept coming from the same spots as before, almost like something was moving just under the surface, yet nothing was there. No shadow, no fish, no log. Nothing. I considered rowing closer to the lights, but even thinking about it made my hands shake. The cluster drifted slowly, almost lazily, but with a purpose. Every once in a while, one of the lights would brighten slightly, almost like a pulse, and the ripples on the lake would respond, tiny concentric rings forming, almost perfectly timed. I blinked, rubbed my eyes again, and leaned back. "Okay, I'm losing it," I said out loud, though I wasn't really sure if I believed it myself. I took a swig of water from my bottle and tried to focus. The lake was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in around you. My lantern swung gently from the seat post, casting a pool of light in a circle around the boat. Outside that circle, everything was dark. The woods, the shoreline, the lake stretching into blackness. Then one of the lights moved faster, not suddenly, but with a smooth, deliberate glide. It shifted maybe 20 degrees in the sky, then paused. The others followed, adjusting their positions as if mirroring the movement. I realized I was holding my breath. The ripples on the lake started again, small this time, forming patterns that were too regular, too precise to be natural. I reached for my phone to take a picture. My hands were cold and shaking. I lifted it, focused, and in the viewfinder, the lights were gone. Not dimmed, not moved, just gone. I lowered the phone slowly, and that's when I noticed the ripples had stopped too. The lake was perfectly still, as if whatever had been there had been erased. I waited. 10 minutes. 15. Nothing. No lights, no ripples, no sound beyond the normal chirp of crickets and the distant call of an owl. My heart was still racing, but I tried to convince myself I was seeing things. Maybe a trick of the lantern, maybe my eyes playing tricks in the darkness. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew the lake had been moving in ways that didn't make sense. I rowed back to shore, slowly, keeping my eyes on the tree line, half expecting the lights to return or some shadow to slip across the water. Nothing appeared. My boots sank slightly into the damp grass as I pulled the boat up, and I dragged it to the small patch of gravel I'd parked on. I left my gear in the boat, my hands still trembling as I locked the oar in place. Walking back to my truck, I tried to shake off the unease. The road back to the highway was narrow, winding through dense trees, and I kept glancing at the treetops. Everything was still, nothing moved, yet in my mind I could still see the lights drifting above the darkened woods, moving slowly, deliberately, silently. By the time I got home, the early morning light was creeping over the horizon. My truck radio only picked up static. I stared out the windshield at the pale light of dawn filtering through the trees, trying to convince myself I was just tired, imagining things. But the memory of the ripples, perfectly circular and precise, and those pale, hovering lights refused to leave. I spent the rest of the day trying to find a rational explanation. Boats on the lake? Flares? Someone playing a prank? Nothing fit. Nothing at all. The lake was empty, the tree line unbroken, and the water smooth as glass. I've gone back to Lake Sylvan since then, more than once, fished the same spots, waited the same hours. Nothing. The lake is normal, the tree line is normal, the world is normal. But sometimes late at night, I can still see them drifting in my mind, the ripples forming in perfect patterns, the pale lights moving slowly above the trees, pulsing ever so faintly, like they exist in a layer of reality I can't touch, can't explain, and can't forget. I was driving home late one night, stuck on the old back road that cuts through the woods outside Millerton. It had been snowing lightly all evening, the kind of snow that settles softly and makes the world feel quieter, almost muffled. My name's Carter Ellis. I worked the night shift at the factory, and driving these roads alone at night was routine, except that night something felt off almost immediately. The road was slick in patches, and my tires made that soft crunching sound on the packed snow. The trees along the side leaned inward, branches heavy with white, and the air smelled like frozen pine. I was halfway home when I noticed headlights in the distance. At first, I thought it was another car, the usual late-night driver making their way down the same stretch. I slowed a bit, easing my foot off the gas, and watched. The lights didn't act like normal headlights. They didn't move along the road itself. Instead, they hovered. I could see it clearly when I got a little closer. They were a few feet above the ground, floating over the snow like some kind of invisible sled was carrying them. My first thought was that I was hallucinating, tired from the shift and staring too long into the dark. But the lights stayed steady, and the snow around them didn't swirl or get disturbed like it would if a car had driven through it. I slowed more, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, squinting through the falling flakes. The lights were coming toward me, steady and bright, but there was no engine sound, no hum, nothing that would tell me there was a motor running. I switched the windshield wipers on, then off, thinking maybe condensation was messing with my vision, but the lights were still there. They weren't moving along the road surface, just hovering above it, keeping pace as if tracking me. My stomach tightened and I glanced at the rearview mirror. Behind me, the road was empty, but those lights kept getting bigger in my windshield. I flicked the high beams on and off, hoping a glare might make me realize it was a truck or a car carrying something reflective. Nothing changed. The lights didn't fade, and the way they hovered made the snow around them look different, like a faint glow pressing down, illuminating the snow without casting shadows. I considered pulling over, maybe getting out, but the snow was slick and the trees were too close. I didn't want to risk sliding off the road, so I stayed in the car, heart thumping, and kept my eyes fixed ahead. I could feel my breathing shallow, my fingers tight on the wheel, every instinct screaming that this wasn't normal. The lights got closer, and I could see a vague shape in them. Maybe a vehicle, maybe not. There was no detail, no texture, just an outline that seemed almost wrong, perfectly smooth, like a silhouette cut from shadow, hovering, silent. I blinked, trying to shake off the tension, and when I opened my eyes again, the lights were still moving toward me, unchanged. Then, just as I was calculating whether to swerve into the snowbank to avoid it, the lights started to vanish. Not fade like turning off a car, but vanish, starting from the top and edges, leaving the center for a moment before that too disappeared. I watched, paralyzed, as they slipped into nothingness while keeping pace with me. They didn't slow down. They didn't change trajectory. They just disappeared midair, hovering over the snow like they were never there. I slammed the brakes instinctively, then realized I hadn't crashed into anything. The road was empty, and the only sound was the soft squeak of tires over snow. My heart was pounding, and I sat there for several minutes, gripping the wheel and staring down the road. Nothing returned. No headlights, no glow, nothing. After a long while, I started the car again, slowly, checking every mirror, every shadow, but the road was just the road. Trees lined it like they always did, snow settled softly on branches, and the air had that same pine scent. I kept driving, cautious, my eyes darting to every dark shape, half expecting it to reappear. I reached the main road eventually, where the streetlights cut through the snow and the world felt normal again. Traffic was light, just a few cars here and there, headlights behaving as they should. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a second I thought I saw a faint flicker of light far behind me, but it was gone before I could be sure. When I got home, I parked in the garage and sat there for a long time with the engine running. I couldn't explain what I had seen. A few hours later, I told myself it was fatigue, a trick of snow and headlights, maybe even some reflection in the windshield. But it wasn't like any trick I'd ever seen. The lights hadn't followed the road, they hadn't reacted to anything, and they hadn't made a sound. The next day, I drove the same back road in daylight, checking the areas where the lights had been. Nothing. The snow was mostly gone, leaving muddy tracks from tire treads, but no sign of anything unusual. I asked a coworker if he had seen anything strange that night. He hadn't. A local neighbor said they hadn't noticed anything on that road either. It's been weeks now, and I haven't told anyone else about it. I still drive that back road at night because it's the fastest way home, but I keep my eyes on the dark patches between trees, my foot hovering over the brake pedal. I can't explain what I saw. The hovering lights, the silent motion, the way they disappeared without slowing down. I'm not sure I ever will. Sometimes when it snows lightly, I think about that stretch of road, the way the lights moved, and I wonder if they're still there, just waiting for the right night, hovering silently, unseen, until someone else comes along. I'd been out in the fields all day, up before sunrise, moving between the rows, checking the corn. It had been hot, humid, that sticky kind of late summer heat that clings to your skin and makes the back ache by midday. My name's Sam Harlow. I run this farm mostly on my own now that my dad's retired, and most nights I'm the only one around. That evening I had stayed late, just wandering between the rows to check for pests or any signs of mold. It was after 8 when I decided to call it quits. The sun had dipped behind the tree line, leaving a faint orange glow over the field. The air smelled like dry soil and crushed leaves, a scent I normally find comforting. That night, it felt different, though, like the smell was heavier, denser. I was standing near the center of the field when I first noticed it. The corn wasn't still. At first, I thought the wind had picked up, but I didn't feel a breeze, not even the faintest stir. And yet the stalks started to lean, slowly at first, then faster, all bending toward one corner of the field. It was like some invisible hand was sweeping through, pressing the crops down in one fluid motion. I stopped moving, unsure if I was seeing things. The rustle was soft, a uniform swoosh through the leaves, almost musical, but with no rhythm I could pinpoint. I blinked and stepped closer, trying to figure out what could be causing it. There was nothing there. No animals, no people, no tractors. The edge of the field was dark, lined with trees, and there wasn't a hint of movement beyond the rustling corn. I lifted my hand to shield my eyes, half expecting headlights or some sort of vehicle, but the field stayed the same. The bending continued, slow and deliberate, like the plants were being guided by some force I couldn't see. My heart started beating faster. I'm not prone to superstition, but in that moment, the farm felt wrong. The usual creaks and chirps of nighttime insects were drowned out by that quiet swoosh of moving plants. I turned in a slow circle, trying to find anything that would explain it. Nothing. The corner of the field where the corn was leaning looked perfectly normal beyond the bend. No machines, no tracks, no shadows. I fumbled for my phone, thinking maybe I could record it. My hands were slick with sweat, and the phone felt slippery. By the time I had it out, the movement had slowed to a stop. The corn leaned heavily toward that corner. Some stalks pressed nearly flat against the soil, but the air was still again. I stayed frozen for a long minute, staring at it, half expecting something to appear from the darkness, some shape that had caused it. Nothing came. I muttered to myself, calling it a weird wind, or maybe just my imagination running wild after a long day. But it didn't feel right. I walked toward the leaning section cautiously, careful not to step on the flattened stalks, and searched the ground. No tracks. Not even a dent where a deer might have passed. The soil was soft, freshly watered from the morning irrigation, and yet perfectly intact. I walked back toward the farmhouse, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The corn stayed bent, still leaning toward the corner like it had been swept there by some invisible current. I kept my flashlight aimed at the field edge, half expecting a figure or some movement. My stomach twisted as I passed through the rows. The shadows seemed off. They stretched the wrong way, flickering briefly in my light as though the corn had its own mind. When I got to the porch, I leaned against the railing, trying to shake the unease. The night was silent now. No rustle, no hum, no wind. I went inside, double-checked the locks, and turned on every light I could reach. I told myself it was probably a late deer, a gust of wind combined with exhaustion, or maybe just the shadows playing tricks in the dim orange glow. But even then, I couldn't stop thinking about the way the entire field had moved as one. That coordinated motion didn't make sense. The next morning, I went back to inspect the field. In daylight, the bent corn looked normal, like nothing had happened. Some stalks leaned slightly more than others, but nothing unusual. I walked through the rows carefully, searching for footprints, crushed leaves, anything. The ground was undisturbed, just soft dirt with irrigation tracks from the previous day. There were no signs of machinery or animals having passed through that night. Even the corner toward which the corn had bent looked completely untouched. I told my neighbor Joe about it over coffee. He's older, has lived around here forever, and he laughed it off. Must have been one of them weird thermals, Sam, he said. Night drafts in the field sometimes get strong. I tried to explain the synchronized bend, the sound of the corn moving as though pushed by something unseen, but he just shook his head. Corn's sensitive, son. You get tired, start seeing shapes in the dark. I wanted to agree, really, but I couldn't shake the memory. The way the stalks had bent, moving in perfect sync, the way the sound had filled the field without a source. Something about it didn't fit anything I knew about weather, wind, or wildlife. Even now, when I pass the field at night, I get a tight feeling in my chest, like the ground itself is holding a secret I can't reach. I've kept an eye on that corner since, and nothing has happened again. No sudden bends, no strange sounds, just the normal swaying of corn in the breeze, the familiar creak of leaves, the rustle of small critters. But I think about that night a lot, how the crops leaned, the field moving towards some invisible point, and the silence afterward. I've never found an explanation that fits. It hasn't affected the rest of my life in a big way. I still wake before sunrise, still tend the farm, still enjoy the smell of soil and hay in the mornings. But there's a corner in that field I avoid walking through at night. Even under the moonlight, it feels different. The shadows stretch oddly, and I can't help imagining the way the corn bent, moving as one, responding to something I'll never see. I've considered setting up cameras, lights, anything to catch it if it happens again. But I'm hesitant. Part of me doesn't want to know, doesn't want to interfere with whatever moved through that field that night. For now, I watch from the porch, letting the quiet settle around me, and the field remains still under the stars. I don't understand it. Maybe I never will. I had stayed late at the diner again, wiping down counters and running the dishwasher until the last plate was done. By the time I left, it was past 1 a.m., and the world outside felt completely empty. The road from the diner back to my place runs alongside a wide field that stretches up to the tree line at the top of the hill. Normally, it's nothing but quiet, just wind in the grass, the occasional owl. That night, though, something felt off. I had my jacket zipped up and my hands tucked into my pockets, boots squelching in the damp grass where the rain from earlier had soaked the soil. Then I heard it, a metallic clicking sound. Sharp, rhythmic, echoing just above me. It wasn't like any animal I knew, not like birds or deer stepping on twigs, and it wasn't far away, It sounded like it was directly over my head, but I couldn't see anything at first. I froze, my eyes straining to catch something in the low clouds and stars. Then, just as I tilted my head back, I saw it. A perfectly straight black edge moving across the sky. It cut through the stars like someone had laid a ruler against the night. There were no lights, no markings, just this long, dark line drifting silently, slowly. My stomach turned in that cold, lurching way it does when something doesn't fit any pattern I know. I took a step back. My boots sank slightly into the wet grass. The clicking continued, steady, like it was measuring time with some purpose I couldn't understand. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a plane wing or a low-flying drone, but nothing fit. Drones aren't that wide, that precise, and they make noise. Planes have navigation lights and engines. This was different. I lifted my phone, trying to capture it. The screen barely lit the grass at my feet, but when I raised it toward the sky, the straight edge was still there, perfectly aligned with the stars. I zoomed in, hoping for a clearer shot, and the camera distorted the view just enough that the darkness seemed thicker around the edge. It didn't move faster. It didn't wobble. It just slid along, perfectly straight. I started walking, cautiously, toward the road that would take me back to the nearest streetlight. The clicking seemed to follow, but it was impossible to tell if it was actually moving with me or if my mind had latched onto it, creating a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The air was still, the kind of still that makes every small noise sound huge, and I could feel my own pulse thumping in my ears. I noticed something strange as I moved. The stars near the edge seemed dimmer, almost muted, like the dark line was sucking out the light. I blinked, and for a fraction of a second, the edge appeared closer, though I couldn't explain why. Then it continued along its path, silent except for that clicking, like it was on rails I couldn't see. I tried calling out, half expecting someone to answer, but the field swallowed my voice. My own words sounded foreign in the quiet. I thought about running back to the diner, to some light, some civilization, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The edge moved this deliberate, slow precision that made every instinct in my body tense up. The field ahead had patches of taller grass that looked like shadows at first, but as I walked, they seemed arranged in strange angular shapes. Rectangles, maybe triangles, lined up in the dark. I couldn't tell if they were natural or if my mind was interpreting the shapes wrong, but something about them made me quicken my pace. Then my watch stopped. Not dead, not a battery issue. It just froze at 1:14 a.m. I shook it, tapped it, even tried resetting it, but nothing changed. When I looked back up, the dark edge had slowed, almost paused, over the tree line, and the clicking had sped up just slightly, like a metronome skipping a beat. I started jogging toward the road, boots splashing through puddles, jacket soaked from the mist in the air. My phone was dead before I could even try to take another picture. I kept glancing back, expecting it to follow, but by the time I reached the asphalt, the edge was gone. The stars were back to normal, unbroken, and the air had lost that heavy, expectant quality. I leaned against the hood of my car, gasping, and waited for a few minutes, half expecting it to reappear. Nothing. Just the normal night sounds, distant crickets, the soft rustle of the trees. I tried to tell myself I imagined it, that the tired brain of someone working late had made the stars dance and the edge appear. But I knew better. The metallic clicking, the frozen watch, the dimming of the stars around the shadow, I'd experienced it. My own rational explanations fell short. The next morning, I checked the field. Nothing was out of place, no strange patterns in the grass, no footprints, no evidence of anything out of the ordinary. I walked the perimeter slowly, boots crunching on gravel, but the field was just a field. Normal. Ordinary. The kind of place that shouldn't have a straight black line sliding silently across the sky at night. I haven't gone back after dark since that night. Even now, when I look at stars near my apartment, I catch myself squinting, imagining a dark edge slicing through constellations, and I feel the same unease creeping up my spine. I don't know what it was. I can't explain it, and I can't make sense of the clicking. All I know is that it existed, and the memory is as precise and unyielding as the straight edge I saw moving across the sky that night. Sometimes I wake up thinking I hear it, the metallic click just above me, steady and measured, like a pulse against the quiet. And for a moment, I imagine that dark edge is still up there somewhere, sliding silently across the stars, waiting for someone else to walk into the field and notice. I left the bar later than I planned, the kind of late where the roads are empty and the air smells like cold metal and wet grass. It had rained earlier, and the field that cut between the road and my apartment was half mud, half ankle-deep puddles. I had my hands shoved into the pockets of my jacket and my hood up, just trying to get home without thinking too hard about anything. That's when I heard it. A sharp, metallic clicking, like a typewriter hitting the same key over and over, coming from above. At first I froze, thinking it was a branch in the wind or a power line swaying, but the sound was too deliberate. The intervals were too exact, almost like someone or something was tapping out a pattern, faint but steady. I squinted into the dark, trying to catch something in the night sky. The stars were out, clear and bright, which made the shadows between them feel darker than usual. Then I saw it. A perfectly straight edge sliding across the stars. It wasn't a plane, not at first glance anyway. The edges were crisp, like a ruler laid across the sky, and it moved in a smooth mechanical glide. No lights, no blinking navigation markers, no noise except for that clicking. It was wide enough to blot out a few constellations at once. I stumbled back a step, raising my hands instinctively, trying to process what I was seeing. I blinked, and for a moment it seemed to pause. Not hover exactly, just stop. Then it continued, still silent in the void, still perfectly straight. My brain was racing, trying to identify something familiar, anything. A low-flying plane with its lights off, military equipment, a crane somehow lifted impossibly into the sky. Nothing fit. I started walking again, slower this time, eyes locked on the moving shadow. The field stretched out ahead, wet and uneven. The clicking sound followed me, though I couldn't tell if it was actually moving with me or if it was a projection of my mind trying to understand the impossible. Each step I took, the edge seemed to shift a fraction, ever so subtly, like it was responding to my movement. I pulled out my phone, ready to take a picture, but the screen barely illuminated the grass beneath me. When I lifted it, the dark edge was still there, sliding across the stars, and the clicking continued, steady and strange. I tried to zoom in, and the camera distorted the image. Pixels stretched, angles skewed, but the straight edge persisted, impossible and real. I thought about turning back toward the road, but something rooted me there. A part of me didn't want to blink, didn't want to take my eyes off it. My fingers trembled around the phone, and the wet ground squelched under my boots. The wind had died down, no rustle of leaves, no hum of the distant highway, just that constant metallic clicking. At one point, I glanced down and realized my watch had stopped. Not dead, not out of battery, just frozen. I shook my wrist. Nothing. When I looked back up, the shadow had shifted slightly, still perfectly straight, still sliding across the stars. The movement wasn't like anything natural. No flutter, no wobble, just smooth, surgical displacement. I tried talking to myself. It's probably a drone, I muttered, but even as the words left my lips, I knew that explanation didn't fit. Drones have rotors, lights, and they make noise. This had none of that. And drones that large? There were no drones this size that could glide like that without engines. I took a step backward, trying to put more field between me and whatever it was, though why I thought distance would matter, I don't know. The field was long. The farther I walked, the more the edges of the sky seemed off. Not warped exactly, but stretched, like the shadow left an imprint on the darkness itself. The stars near the edge seemed dimmer, almost like they were being absorbed or blocked in a way that didn't make sense. I felt a faint vibration in the soles of my feet, like the earth itself was aware of it, reacting slowly, almost imperceptibly. After a few minutes that might have been seconds, I noticed something else. The field ahead looked different. Not the grass, but the shapes. I couldn't see them clearly, but there were rectangles, or maybe triangles, just out of focus, aligned strangely in the tall grass. The clicking intensified, faster now, almost like a heartbeat. I froze. Sadie, my neighbor's dog, had followed me out into the field and now growled at nothing in particular. Her hackles were raised. She circled and barked low, then quieted, ears forward, fixated on the same spot I was. I swallowed hard. My phone battery was dropping fast, the cold sapping it more than usual. I debated running, calling someone, anything, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The straight edge had slowed, or maybe stopped. It was impossible to tell. The stars behind it were shifting imperceptibly, subtly moving out of place like a slow wave. Then it happened. The edge made a subtle change in trajectory, a movement so slight I almost missed it, but it was enough to create the impression of sliding closer. Not directly down, never that, but diagonal, just enough that my peripheral vision caught the shift before my mind fully processed it. That's when I realized the field behind me was empty, completely. No trees, no distant houses, nothing, just dark, wet grass. And yet the feeling of being watched was immediate, encompassing. I ran, not sprinted, because the mud caught my boots, but ran with the pace of fear gripping my spine. The clicking followed exactly in time with my heartbeat, or maybe it was the other way around. When I reached the road, I turned to look back. Nothing. No edge, no shadow, no clicking. Just the regular night sky and scattered stars. My heart slowed, my lungs burned, and I pressed myself against the side of the field, trying to convince my brain that I hadn't been hallucinating. I walked the rest of the way home slowly, head down, boots squelching in the mud. I checked the field when I got to the corner, phone in hand. No shapes, no shadows, no sound. The streetlights flickered, but nothing unusual. I unlocked my apartment, shoved my jacket on a hook, and sat on the edge of the bed, shaking. Later, I tried to describe it to anyone who would listen. My roommate, Mark, laughed and said I'd had one too many beers. "You're fine, man," he said. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd heard. My watch had stopped, the stars had shifted subtly, the field had felt wrong. I haven't gone back to that field at night since. Sometimes I see the sky in a certain way, the stars in a slightly wrong alignment, and my stomach twists. I don't know if it was a drone, some secret military tech, or something else entirely. I only know that straight edge, sliding silently across the stars, the metallic click echoing in the quiet field. I can't explain it. I can't forget it. And sometimes when the wind is still and the night is dark, I swear I can hear that click in the distance, like it never really left. I was working nights at a distribution warehouse on the edge of town last year. Most nights ended the same way. Clock out around 3 in the morning, walk across the empty lot, drive home half asleep, maybe grab fast food if I was starving. The routine was boring but reliable. That's why what happened sticks in my head. I know every part of that place by heart, and that night something wasn't right from the second I stepped outside. It was early March, one of those nights where the air had that damp cold that seeps through your jacket. The warehouse was quiet as I pushed the door open and walked out into the lot. Usually there'd be at least one other guy leaving around the same time, but my shift had been slower, so it was just me. The lot lights buzzed overhead, tall poles spaced around the asphalt. They always gave off that faint hum you stopped noticing after a while. I started across the lot toward my car, which was parked a little ways from the building under one of the older street lamps. I hit the unlock button on my key fob, heard the click, and pulled the handle. Right then, I noticed something weird. The hood felt warm when I brushed against it with my leg. At first, I thought I was imagining it, so I set my palm flat on the metal. It was definitely warm. Not scalding, but like it had been running recently. The thing was, I hadn't driven it since 9 that night. It had sat there for 6 solid hours in the cold. It should have been freezing to the touch, same as the rest of the car. I stood there with my hand on it for a while, just frowning, trying to come up with a normal explanation. Maybe the streetlight had been heating it, but the light was above and to the side, not close enough to warm an entire hood. Plus, the roof of the car was cold. While I was thinking about this, the streetlight above me flickered. Once, then again, then it went out completely. The buzzing stopped too. The sudden quiet was strange. It was like the whole lot exhaled. I froze with my hand still on the hood. The only light now came from the warehouse behind me and another lamp way across the lot. Everything around my car was darker than it should have been. I got into the driver's seat fast, shut the door, and locked it. When I turned the key, the engine turned over fine, no hesitation. The dash lights glowed, heater kicked on. Everything normal, except the clock on the dash read 3:42. I know I'd clocked out at 3:04. It was less than a minute walk from the door to the lot. I remembered checking my phone when I left. Somehow, nearly 40 minutes had passed between then and me sitting in the car. That made me feel sick in a way I can't explain, like a missing tooth you keep tonguing at. I stared at the clock for a long time, then pulled my phone out of my jacket pocket. The lock screen said 3:42 too. Notifications stacked up like usual. No calls, no texts, just missing time. I drove out of the lot slower than usual, headlights cutting through the dark stretch of road leading back to town. A few blocks away, there was a four-way intersection where I always hit a red light, and sure enough, it was red. While I sat there, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. Another car was sitting behind me. No headlights, just there, dark and low. The streetlight at the intersection was working fine, so I could see the outline of it. Looked like a compact sedan, maybe silver or gray. I watched in the mirror, waiting for whoever it was to turn their lights on. They never did. I tapped my brake pedal a few times, half a signal, half a nervous tick. The car didn't react. When the light changed, I pulled forward. The dark car pulled forward too, staying a car length behind. I drove through a couple turns, trying to shake it, but it followed everyone. I finally turned into a gas station, figuring if someone was messing with me, they'd keep going once I pulled under the bright canopy. Instead, the car turned in too, rolling to a stop on the far side of the lot. Still no headlights, just idling in the dark. I sat there, gripping the wheel, pretending to check my phone. I could feel my pulse in my ears. After about a minute, the other car slowly rolled out of the lot, no lights the whole time. It disappeared down the highway. I didn't move right away. I just sat there, engine running, breathing hard. When I finally drove home, I kept checking my mirrors every few seconds, but the road stayed empty. When I got home, I parked on the street instead of my driveway for some reason, like maybe it mattered if someone was watching. I went inside, locked the door, and sat on the couch with the lights on until the sun came up. The next day, when I went to leave for work again, the hood of my car was cold. Everything looked normal. Nothing wrong with the streetlight in the lot either. It was back on, buzzing like always. I never figured out what happened with the time or why the hood had been warm. But every night after that, I parked under the lights closest to the warehouse door, and I never lingered in the lot again. We were somewhere west of Gallup when it started. My girlfriend and I had been driving all day, taking turns behind the wheel, and by the time we hit that stretch of desert highway, it was already after midnight. The sky was completely clear. No moon, just stars everywhere. You don't realize how thick they are until you're in the middle of nowhere like that. No light pollution, just black sky and pinpricks of white. I was driving. She was half asleep in the passenger seat, her face glowing faintly from the dash lights. The road was dead quiet. We hadn't passed another car in at least an hour. The only sound was the tires on asphalt and that faint whistle of air you always get in an old sedan. At one point, she sat up and rolled her shoulders, looking out the window. I asked if she wanted me to pull over so she could stretch, but she shook her head. Then she frowned, squinting up at the sky. I figured she'd spotted a plane or maybe a shooting star, so I glanced up too, just quick enough not to veer the car. At first, it looked totally normal, just stars, thick and bright. But after a few seconds, I noticed something off. A cluster of them, maybe a patch the size of my fist if I held it up, was sliding, not like twinkling or moving with the Earth's rotation. This was drifting. The stars inside that patch stayed in their same little arrangement, but the whole group was slowly sliding left across the sky. I blinked a few times, trying to clear my eyes, thought maybe I was tired and seeing floaters. But when I focused again, it was still happening. The stars weren't twinkling like the others either. They looked steady, like they'd been printed on glass and someone was dragging the pane. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to the windshield, and whispered, "Do you see that?" I nodded without answering. My throat felt dry. I eased off the gas, not braking, just letting the car coast. I wanted to pull over but couldn't bring myself to. Out there, it was just us and that endless desert. The thought of stopping under that sky made me feel exposed in a way I can't explain. The drift was slow but noticeable. Over the course of a minute, that whole patch slid maybe a hand's width against the rest of the stars. That's when I realized there weren't stars behind it. Where it moved from, the sky stayed empty, like it had blotted out what should have been there. It hit me then that we weren't looking at stars moving. We were looking at something blocking them, moving in front of them. Something enormous and silent. I gripped the wheel tighter and muttered, "It's not the stars." She didn't reply. She just hugged her knees up and kept staring, breathing fast through her nose. A few minutes later, the car's radio fuzzed. We didn't have anything playing. It was just static because we'd lost stations hours earlier, but suddenly it crackled. A burst of sound that made both of us jump. Then it went dead silent again, even quieter than before, like the speakers had been unplugged. She reached over and turned the volume knob back and forth. Nothing. I tapped the console and kept driving, my palms slick. The drift continued. Every so often I'd check the rearview mirror, and for a second I thought I saw more patches, faint and dark, sliding above and behind us, like pieces of the sky were breaking loose and floating away. I didn't point it out. She looked terrified enough without me adding more. We drove like that for maybe 40 minutes. I couldn't bring myself to stop, though my legs ached from holding the same position. Every instinct said to just keep moving, even though there was no real plan. I kept expecting to see headlights in the distance, another car, anything, but the highway stayed empty. At one point, she said my name, soft, and pointed out her window. I glanced and saw a faint line of lights, not bright like stars, but duller, more yellow. They were arranged in a straight row, hovering low above the horizon, perfectly even. They didn't blink, didn't waver. They just floated there. I stared too long and drifted onto the rumble strip. The vibration snapped me back and I corrected, heart racing. When I looked again, the row of lights was gone. She pulled her hoodie up over her head and curled toward the door like she couldn't look anymore. Sometime around 2, I finally saw a green reflective sign for a rest stop. My hands were cramping on the wheel, but I didn't want to stop there either. I imagined pulling in and looking up to find that dark patch hovering right above us, blocking everything else out. We pushed on until nearly 3, when the faint glow of another town finally appeared ahead. Gas stations, motel signs, power lines. The ordinary stuff felt unreal after so much empty blackness. I pulled into a 24-hour diner parking lot and just sat there, engine idling, staring through the windshield. The sky over the town looked normal again. Stars in their places. Nothing sliding, nothing blotted out. Neither of us mentioned it to the waitress when we went inside. We didn't even talk about it to each other until weeks later when she finally said, "You saw it too, right? That it wasn't just the stars." I told her yes, and that was the end of it. I was driving home late from a job site in southern Ohio. It was a Thursday in early October, cool but not yet cold, and the sky had cleared after a light drizzle that passed through earlier in the evening. The air still smelled damp, and the road was slick in patches. I'd finished up later than expected, and by the time I left the little town of Wellston, it was after midnight. My route took me along a 2-lane road that cut through stretches of farmland and woods, the kind of road where you can drive for miles without seeing another set of headlights. I wasn't tired yet. I'd had too much coffee around 9. So I had the radio low, just background noise, and my windows cracked enough to hear the insects outside. That's why it stuck out to me when, around 1 in the morning, I noticed the hum of bugs seemed thinner. Not gone completely, but quieter than it should have been for a warm night out there. A couple miles later, I came around a bend where the trees pressed close to both sides of the road, like a tunnel, and that's when I saw them. Off to my right, maybe half a mile ahead and just above the tree line, was a row of lights. 6, maybe 7, lined up in a perfect horizontal line. They weren't beams, not like a searchlight. They were solid points, white with the faintest bluish tint, steady and unblinking. At first I thought it was a tower, except there was no structure under them. No blinking red marker like you usually see. And they weren't high. They were hovering just above the treetops, low enough that I could make out gaps between them where the dark sky showed through. I slowed the truck and kept watching, half expecting them to vanish or resolve into something ordinary. But they didn't move. They just hung there, silent. When the road opened into a stretch of flat ground, I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. My headlights lit up the wet weeds and a barbed wire fence, and beyond that was just dark pasture running into the woods. The lights were still there, straight across, maybe 100 feet above the tallest trees. I killed the engine so I could hear better. That's when it hit me how quiet it was. No crickets, no night birds. Even the breeze seemed to have dropped. I remember thinking it was like someone had muted the world. I reached for my phone, which was sitting in the cup holder. My hands were shaking just enough that I fumbled unlocking the screen. I brought up the camera, pointed it through the windshield, and before I could snap the picture, the lights blinked out. Not one by one, not like they drifted away, just gone. The darkness over the trees was total. I sat there frozen, staring at where they'd been. The silence stretched out. I thought maybe they'd reappear, but nothing. Just that damp smell of earth and the faint pinging sound of the engine cooling under the hood. After a minute, I turned my phone flashlight on and stepped out. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted proof I hadn't imagined it, some angle where I could see them again. I walked to the fence and shined the light toward the pasture, but the beam didn't reach far before the dark swallowed it. I could see the tree line clearly, though. Nothing moved. I stood there longer than I meant to, waiting for something to happen, my ears strained for any sound at all. When it finally came, it startled me so bad I almost dropped the phone. A single crow croaked from somewhere back in the woods. Just one. Then nothing again. I climbed back in the truck and sat there with the doors locked, phone in my lap, headlights still off. My own breathing sounded too loud. I don't know how long I waited like that. Long enough that the windows fogged a little. Finally, I started the engine. The sound was harsh after that long silence, but it grounded me. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the road, keeping my eyes fixed ahead. I drove slower than usual, scanning the tree line in case the lights came back. They never did. But about 10 minutes later, I noticed something else. My radio had been on before, low volume, tuned to a classic rock station. When I left the job site, it was playing normally. But when I reached to turn it up again, there was nothing but static. Not the sharp hiss you get when you're between stations either. It was a flat, steady crackle, almost like rushing air. I checked the dial, thinking maybe I'd knocked it somehow, but it was still set to the same station. I scanned across the whole band, and every frequency was the same, just that rushing static. I switched it off. By the time I hit the next small town, the static was gone and the stations came in fine. Streetlights, the glow from a gas station, a car pulling out ahead of me, normal things. But when I stopped to fill up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me those last miles. I got home around 3. I didn't sleep right away. I just sat at the kitchen table with the phone in my hand, scrolling back through my photos like maybe I'd find a picture I didn't remember taking. There wasn't one. The strangest part is how my memory of the lights feels. Clear, sharp, like I can still see the exact spacing between them. But everything around it, the drive after the gas station, even unlocking my front door, feels hazy, like it all happened underwater. I don't know what I saw out there. All I know is it wasn't a tower or a plane or anything I can explain. And the silence when those lights went out, that's what stayed with me the most. Like the whole world held its breath until I drove away. I was washing dishes when I first noticed it. My kitchen window looks out over the street, and through the trees I caught these blinking red and white lights moving low over the houses. At first glance, I figured it was just a news helicopter, or maybe police. This was in late October, a little after 9 at night, so already full dark. It had been drizzling earlier, and the pavement still had that wet shine under the streetlights. The lights moved slowly, circling. That's what made me pay attention. Normally helicopters cut across, maybe hover for a minute, but this one seemed to be deliberately orbiting the neighborhood. The blinking looked standard enough, red on one side, white on the other, but it wasn't in the exact rhythm I was used to seeing. I dried my hands on a towel and stood there for a minute, watching it drift behind the roofs. I eventually stepped out onto my back deck for a better view. From there, I could see over toward the elementary school, 2 blocks away, and sure enough, the thing was out there, low above the trees, coming around again. My first thought was that Something had happened at the school, but there weren't any sirens or extra traffic, just this thing circling. What struck me after a few minutes was how quiet it was. I kept waiting for that familiar chop of rotor blades, but all I heard was distant cars on the main road and the hum of someone's AC unit. Even when it drifted closer, maybe no higher than a few hundred feet, there was nothing. No vibration, no thump, not even the faint whir you get from drones. Just silence. I went back inside and grabbed my phone to zoom in. The camera didn't help much. It was mostly blurry dots, and every time I tried to focus, it slipped out of frame. I stepped back out, and that's when I realized the blades weren't moving. There was a shape there like the long top of a helicopter, but it was frozen. The light blinked from the ends, giving the impression of a rotor sweep, but the thing itself was still. That made my stomach knot. I don't know why. Maybe because my brain kept telling me it should be spinning, and it wasn't. I told myself it was an angle thing. Maybe I just couldn't see it right. But when it came closer again, right over Maple Street, I could see perfectly. It was like a helicopter outline with the top bar stiff, like a toy someone had glued together wrong. I stayed out there too long, just staring. At one point, my neighbor Tom came out to let his dog pee, and I almost called him over, but something stopped me. I didn't want to explain what I was looking at. I don't even know why. The dog barked twice and then went dead quiet, ears flat. Tom looked up for a second but didn't seem to notice anything unusual and went back in. When it swung around the fourth or fifth time, it slowed. That was when I felt the air change. It was subtle, like when you open the freezer door and the cold spills out, except the whole backyard felt that way. The crickets, which had been steady all night, cut off. Completely. The only sound left was the wet drip of my gutter. I remember actually whispering, "Okay, what the hell?" under my breath. It wasn't even conscious, more like my body needed to hear a voice, even if it was mine. I pulled my phone up again, hands shaking so much the video was useless. Just streaks of light. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the lights blinked off. No fade, no drifting away. They were just gone. I expected to see the dark shape still against the sky, but there was nothing. Empty. The streetlights reflected off the wet roofs like normal. The quiet stretched on way too long. I must have stood there 10 minutes, straining to hear anything. My neighbor's dog never barked again. I finally went inside, locked both the back door and the front, even though I usually don't bother, and sat on the couch with all the lights off, just listening. At some point I realized an hour had gone by without me noticing. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no alerts about police activity or anything like that. I walked room to room, looking out each window. Everything was normal. When I finally tried to sleep, it was close to midnight. Laying there, I swore I could still hear something faint. Not outside, but more like in my own ears. A steady hum, very low, like when you drive under power lines. It lasted long enough that I put a pillow over my head. By morning, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as always. No one mentioned helicopters, no news story about anything happening. I even asked Tom later in the week if he'd seen anything strange that night. He shook his head, said no, and asked if I'd locked myself out or something because he'd noticed me standing out on the deck. I didn't press it. I just said I'd been looking at the weather. That was 2 years ago. I haven't seen it since. I woke up on a Thursday in late March, around 9 in the morning. My first class that day wasn't until 11. Stayed in bed a little longer, scrolling through my phone. That's when I noticed a video in my camera roll that I definitely hadn't taken. It was sitting there at the top of my gallery, 2 hours long, time-stamped from 2:07 a.m. to 4:11 a.m. At first, I thought maybe I'd rolled over in my sleep and hit the record button by accident. But the phone had been on my desk across the room, plugged in. I don't keep it in bed with me. I opened the video and saw nothing but my ceiling. Just the plain white plaster above my desk, lit faintly by the glow of the street lamp through my blinds. It was angled up perfectly, like the phone had been set there deliberately. The camera hadn't moved once in the entire 2 hours. The part that stopped me from just deleting it was the sound. There was this faint, steady humming in the background. Not loud, low and even, like the tone of an old fluorescent light, except it didn't waver. It stayed the exact same pitch the whole time. I live alone in a small off-campus apartment. Third floor of a quiet building. No roommates, no pets. I thought maybe it was something outside like construction equipment or a generator, but I've lived there a year and never heard anything like it. The weirdest part was how it ended. The video just cut off mid-frame like someone had hit stop. Not like the phone had died or run out of space, just stopped clean. I didn't know what to think. I sat there in bed staring at my phone for a good 10 minutes before I worked up the nerve to watch the video straight through. It was exactly what I said. 2 hours of ceiling, no movement, no voices. Just that hum. That day in class, I kept zoning out, thinking about it. I even put my earbuds in during a lecture and skipped around the video, listening for anything. Footsteps, breathing, anything human. But it was just the tone, unbroken. That night, I set my phone on the desk again, same as usual, but I turned the camera toward the wall, just in case. I figured if something happened again, at least I'd have a different angle. When I woke up the next morning, I checked immediately. Nothing. No new video, nothing strange. I tried to let it go, told myself maybe I'd done something without remembering. But by the weekend, it happened again. Saturday morning, 6:40 a.m., there was another video. This time it was 90 minutes long. It started at 3:13 a.m. Same angle, phone pointed at the ceiling, perfectly still, and the same sound. That low hum, constant the whole way through, but about 20 minutes in, there was a faint clicking noise, like metal tapping against metal. 3 quick clicks, then silence, then the hum again. I sat at my desk with headphones on, heart pounding, replaying that section over and over. The clicks weren't random. They sounded intentional, like someone had tapped a pen against my desk, right where the phone was sitting. I checked the apartment, of course. Every corner, closet, bathroom, kitchen cabinets, nothing. My door was still locked from the inside. After that, I started noticing other things, little things. Sunday night, I got into bed around midnight and realized the hum was there even without the phone recording. Faint, but present. Not coming from outside, not from the fridge, not from the HVAC. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like it was in the walls. I barely slept. Every time I started to drift, I'd jerk awake, sure I'd heard something, a soft thump or a scrape, like someone shifting their weight on the floor. By Monday, I was exhausted. I went to campus early and stayed there late, studying in the library just so I wouldn't have to be in the apartment. When I finally came back, I decided to set up my laptop camera too. I angled it at my desk right where I usually charge my phone and left it recording overnight. Tuesday morning, I had another video on my phone, this one only 40 minutes long. Ceiling, hum, then silence. But when I checked the laptop, the file had corrupted. Wouldn't open. That shook me. I don't know why, but the idea that something had interfered with the laptop felt worse than the phone, like it wasn't just random anymore. I called my friend Olivia that day. She lived a few blocks away. I didn't tell her everything, just that I'd been hearing weird noises at night and felt creeped out. She offered to let me crash at her place, but I didn't take her up on it. I didn't want to admit how unsettled I really was. That night, I stayed up on purpose, lights off, sitting in bed with my phone in my hand. Around 2, the hum started. I hadn't been imagining it. It came gradually, rising up from the silence until it filled the room. I froze. I kept staring at the ceiling, waiting for something. I don't know what. I thought maybe I'd see lights through the blinds or movement in the corner, but nothing happened. Just the hum, steady and unbroken. At some point, my phone screen lit up. The camera app had opened by itself. I swear I didn't touch it. It switched to video mode and started recording. The lens aimed straight up. I watched it happen from my bed, too afraid to move. The timer started ticking, 001 to 003, and the phone just sat there, pointed at the ceiling. I don't remember falling asleep. I just remember waking up in the morning with the video still running, 9 hours long. My phone battery had died midway through, around 5:40 a.m. I deleted that one without watching. I couldn't bring myself to sit through it again. Since then, it hasn't happened. No more recordings, no hum, nothing. The apartment is just a normal apartment again. But sometimes late at night, I'll wake up out of nowhere and stare at the ceiling. I'll check my phone to make sure it's locked, make sure the camera isn't running, and in the quiet, I'll strain my ears, waiting for that hum to start up again. I was walking my dog late one night, around 11. Her name's Daisy, a medium-sized mutt with a lot of energy even when I wish she didn't have any. I live in a quiet neighborhood outside of Greensboro, not rural exactly, but not a busy suburb either. Most of the houses are spaced apart with patches of woods between them. The streetlights are scattered and dim, more like weak orange pools instead of anything that makes you feel safe. I usually bring a flashlight when I walk her after dark, but that night I didn't bother. The moon was out, big and pale, and I thought it was enough. I remember noticing how still everything was. No cars going by, no wind in the trees. Even Daisy wasn't pulling on the leash like she usually did. She just trotted beside me, ears twitching. We were halfway down the block, under one of those tall streetlights that throws your shadow onto the pavement like a cutout. I was looking at mine, actually, my shadow and Daisy's. That's when I saw it. There were 3 shadows. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks. I stopped walking, just stood there with Daisy sniffing at the curb. My shadow stretched out clear enough, hers too, wagging tail and everything. But there was another one. Faint. Stretched weirdly above ours, like it was being cast from somewhere higher up. The shape wasn't exact. It looked long, off balance, like something stretched over us, but it definitely matched where the leash was. It even shifted slightly when Daisy moved. I froze. My first thought was that someone was standing behind us. I spun around, quick, but the street was empty. Just the row of houses with most of their windows dark. No movement, no sound. I glanced back at the ground, and for a second, it was just me and Daisy again. 2 shadows. I felt stupid. Probably some glitch in the light, I told myself. I almost kept walking, but something made me look up. There was nothing, just black sky. The moon was behind us, not overhead, and I couldn't see a single star. The weird thing was, there had been stars earlier. I'd noticed them when I first stepped out. Now the sky looked blank, almost painted over. That made my stomach drop. I tugged Daisy along, faster now. She didn't resist, but I could tell she noticed something too. Her ears were back, and she kept glancing up like she was expecting a noise. I tried not to look behind me, but I did anyway. That faint shadow was back, stretched wrong across the pavement a few steps behind us. Not tall like a person's, longer, flatter, like something was spread across the air above us. My brain couldn't make sense of it. It felt like trying to guess a shape underwater. When I finally reached the corner, I cut down a side street I usually avoid because it's darker. My heart was beating fast, but I just wanted to get closer to home. That's when Daisy stopped. Dead stop, nails scraping the pavement. She planted herself and refused to move. I tugged at the leash, but she wouldn't budge. Then I noticed it again, her leash hanging down, our shadows on the road, and above them that faint stretched one. Except this time, it wasn't faint. It was darker, sharper. I actually whispered out loud, "What is that?" The air felt heavy, like before a thunderstorm, except no storm was coming. I looked up again. This time I didn't see empty black. There was a patch of the sky that looked wrong, like a cutout. The edges weren't straight, but they were clear. A darker shape against the dark sky, big enough that it covered part of the moon's glow. I blinked hard, thinking maybe my eyes were adjusting weird, but when I opened them, it was still there. The shape was shifting, barely moving, almost like it was gliding. I couldn't hear anything. No hum, no engine, just the sound of my own breathing. Daisy whimpered and sat down right there in the street, tail tucked. She wouldn't look up, just kept staring at the ground. I don't know how long I stood frozen like that. Could have been 30 seconds, could have been 5 minutes. Eventually, I forced myself to start walking again. I didn't run, though I wanted to. My legs felt stiff, like they weren't getting the message. Every few steps, I glanced down. That third shadow followed us all the way to my street. When I turned into my driveway, I finally saw other lights. Our porch light, the neighbor's floodlight. The shadows looked normal again. Just me and Daisy. I risked one last glance at the sky. Whatever that darker shape had been, it was gone. The stars were back. Inside the house, Daisy ran straight to her crate and curled up, which she never does without a command. I sat on the couch, still holding the leash in my hand like an idiot. I didn't even take my shoes off for a while. I didn't tell anyone right away. A week later, I mentioned to my neighbor, Mrs. Dalton, that Daisy had acted scared on a walk. She surprised me by saying her cat had been acting strange too. refusing to go outside at night, staring up at the ceiling. She laughed it off, but it made me feel less crazy. I've kept walking Daisy at night since then, but I take a flashlight now, even when the moon's bright, and I try not to look too closely at the shadows. I was elk hunting in the Bitterroot Mountains late September, not far from the Idaho line. It had been a long day, mostly quiet, just me moving between ridges and glassing open meadows. I hadn't seen much besides a cow with her calf at a distance. By sundown, I was beat and decided not to hike back down to the truck. I'd brought a lightweight bivy sack and planned to spend the night where I was. I've done that plenty of times. It saves miles and puts you in position at first light. The spot I chose wasn't perfect, but it was flat enough. A little clearing surrounded by tall pines with a view west through a gap in the trees. By the time I ate something and settled in, the sun was gone and the sky was still glowing, faint orange. I remember thinking how clear the air was. The temperature dropped quick, and once it was fully dark, the stars looked sharp enough to cut. I stayed awake longer than I planned, just lying there listening to the forest. Normally, you hear all kinds of things at night, branches snapping, owls calling, distant coyotes, but that night felt different. Still. Not silent, exactly, but every sound seemed faint, muffled, like the forest was holding its breath. Around 10 or 11, I was staring up at the stars, trying to trace out constellations. I've always liked doing that on hunts, keeps your mind busy. That's when I noticed something odd. There were 3 stars in the northeast part of the sky. I don't know their names, but I'd seen them plenty of times before. They made a kind of uneven triangle. I remember that because I'd used them once to get my bearings. But as I watched, one of them seemed off. It wasn't twinkling the same way as the others. It was steady, sharper. I thought maybe my eyes were tired. I rubbed them and looked again. That's when I realized the star had shifted. Just a little, but enough that the triangle didn't look the same anymore. I sat up, kept staring. After a minute, another one of the 3 moved. Not fast, not like a shooting star. Slow, deliberate. Almost like watching a boat drift on water if you had a fixed point to compare it to. I must have sat there half an hour, watching. The 3rd one stayed put at first, but eventually it slid too. By midnight, those 3 points of light had lined up in a straight row, evenly spaced. Everything else in the sky was normal. Constellations were exactly where they should be. Just those 3 had changed. What unsettled me most wasn't even the lights. It was how quiet it got. At some point, I realized I wasn't hearing anything. No wind, no insects, nothing moving in the brush. The stillness felt thick, like when snow falls and swallows sound, except there was no snow, just crisp fall air. I listened hard, even held my breath, and all I could hear was my own pulse in my ears. I wanted to tell myself it was just my imagination, but I know these mountains. You never get complete silence out there. Even in the dead of night, there's always some noise. I tried to lie back down, but I couldn't take my eyes off that line of lights. They didn't blink, didn't fade, just hung there. I kept thinking maybe they were planes, but planes don't move that slow. And they don't just stop in perfect formation. Drowsiness should have taken over. I'd hiked 10 miles that day, but I never felt tired. My body was heavy, but my brain wouldn't shut down. Every time I blinked, I worried they'd vanish, or worse, be closer. Hours dragged by. I checked my watch more than once, certain it must be broken. At one point it read 1:17. Next time I looked, it said 3:04. I don't remember those 2 hours passing. Around 4, the temperature dropped more, and I finally noticed a sound, a faint ringing, high-pitched, not from my ears, but from the air itself, like a tone that hovered just at the edge of hearing. Daisy chain thin, if that makes sense. It rose and fell so slightly I almost doubted it. Then, just as sudden as it started, it cut out, and with it the forest came back. A crow called somewhere down the slope, sharp and ordinary. I heard the creek I'd camped near, water trickling over rocks. A breeze moved through the pines. It all came rushing back at once, like someone flipped a switch. I looked up. The 3 lights were gone. Not fading, not drifting away. Just gone. I lay there until dawn, too uneasy to sleep. When the first light hit the tops of the trees, I packed up fast and started down the ridge. My legs felt weak, not from the hike, but like I'd been holding tension all night. Back at the truck, I sat there a long while before turning the key. I didn't feel relief being out of the woods, just empty, like whatever I'd seen had drained something out of me. I never told anyone on that trip. A couple weeks later, I tried to bring it up to my friend Wes, another hunter. He laughed it off before I could finish, said I'd probably been looking at satellites. I didn't argue, but I know what I saw. Stars don't rearrange themselves, and forests don't go dead quiet for hours. I woke up sometime around 3 in the morning, though I didn't know it at the time. My watch was buried in my bag, and my phone was shut off to save the battery. I had been camping by myself off a spur trail near Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee, not far from a stream I'd been fishing earlier that day. It wasn't my first solo trip, but it was the first time I'd gone without telling anyone exactly where I planned to set up. I'd picked a spot maybe a mile off the trail, far enough that I was sure nobody would wander past. The thing that woke me wasn't a sound exactly, more like a vibration, a low humming that I could feel through the ground as much as I heard in my ears. At first, half asleep, I thought it was a plane flying over, except it never faded or changed pitch. It just stayed, a steady, faint hum that made my teeth buzz. I laid there in my sleeping bag trying to figure out what it was. My first thought was maybe a generator somewhere, but I was miles from any road or cabin. The nearest ranger station was a good drive away. Then I thought maybe it was my headlamp battery buzzing against something in my bag, but when I shifted, the sound didn't change. That's when I noticed the light. Through the fabric of my tent, I could see the trees outside were faintly glowing. Not like moonlight, this was more even, almost fluorescent. A pale white glow, like someone had strung lanterns in the branches. It flickered in a way, not sharp like lightning, but more like the air itself was lit. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The second the zipper teeth parted, the hum felt louder, closer. I pushed the flap open and poked my head out. The whole forest around me was lit up, pale and washed out. The pines, the undergrowth, even the surface of the stream a little ways down the slope, it all glowed like it was being lit from directly overhead. I craned my neck, but I couldn't see any source, just a kind of hazy brightness above the treetops. For a few seconds, I sat there in the doorway of the tent, half crouched, half kneeling, staring. The humming wasn't painful, but it pressed into me, like standing too close to a speaker at a concert. I stepped out, one foot on the ground, and the air changed. The hum cut off instantly. The glow blinked out. I froze. The woods were pitch black again. No light, no sound except the crickets. My eyes took a moment to adjust, but even when they did, there was nothing unusual. Just the same black shapes of trees, the faint silver of the creek through the gaps. I turned in a slow circle, heart hammering, straining to hear anything. But it was quiet. Too quiet. Not even wind in the branches. No owls, nothing. I thought maybe I'd dreamed it, that I'd sat up in some half-sleep state. But when I ducked back into the tent, the watch I dug out of my bag said 3:07 a.m. I hadn't been asleep long enough to feel that disoriented. I tried to lay back down, but my body wouldn't relax. Every few minutes, I found myself unzipping the flap again, peering out into the darkness. Nothing. Still, the image of that pale light above the trees stuck in my head. Then, maybe half an hour later, the humming came back. This time softer, almost like it was farther away. My chest tightened instantly. I pressed my ear to the ground, and I could feel it faintly, like the earth itself was vibrating. I didn't open the tent right away. I just sat, gripping the zipper pull, debating whether I wanted to see it again. The glow returned, faint through the nylon walls exactly like before, diffused, even, coming from everywhere at once. I forced myself to unzip the flap again. Same sight. The forest lit up, shadows erased, trees shining like they had their own light source. I whispered hello without meaning to. My voice cracked in the silence. Nothing responded. When I stood to look up, I noticed something I hadn't before. The branches weren't swaying, even though I could feel the faintest breath of air against my face. The trees were completely still, like they were frozen. Even the stream below didn't look right. It shimmered, but it wasn't moving. No ripples, no current. I took 2 steps away from the tent, barefoot on the pine needles, staring at the creek. The hum grew sharper, almost a tone now, like a single note being held. And then, Like someone hit a switch, it all cut off again. Darkness, silence, crickets chirping like normal. The trees shifted in the breeze, the water gurgled, everything back the way it should have been. I stumbled back into the tent and zipped it shut, hands shaking. I sat awake until the sky started lightening, not daring to close my eyes. When morning came, the campsite looked completely normal. No burned patches, no unusual marks, nothing in the soil or on the trees. But my sleeping bag was damp with sweat, and my socks were wet from where I'd stood outside. I packed up camp by 7, even though I'd planned to stay another night. On the way back to the trailhead, I kept glancing up through the canopy, waiting for some sign of that glow. There wasn't any. Not during the hike, not when I drove back through the small towns on the way home. Just the usual sky, blue and empty. Still, the memory of that humming sits in me, like something my body remembers more than my mind. When I think back on it, the part that bothers me most isn't the light or the vibration. It's how everything around me had just stopped, like the world itself had been paused for those moments. I was driving home from work, same as I always did, sometime around 11 at night. I worked second shift at a distribution warehouse outside of town, and by the time I clocked out, the parking lot was usually half empty, the air quiet except for the hum of the highway in the distance. I was tired, but it wasn't unusual for me to make that 30-minute drive back to my place in Jamestown. The roads were usually empty that late, especially the county highway that cut through farmland for miles before you hit anything resembling civilization again. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed a bright light in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just a car coming up from behind, maybe someone in a hurry, but the road was dead straight, and the light didn't look quite like headlights. It was higher, like it was positioned above where a car's lights would normally sit, and it didn't seem to bounce with the road. Just a steady, solid glow, too bright and too white to be anything normal. I slowed down, thinking maybe it was a truck with high beams, but it didn't close the gap. It just stayed there, same distance, same intensity. I checked my side mirrors, nothing but darkness. When I looked back again, the light was still there, exactly where it had been. I tried to ignore it for a while. The road was long and flat, and sometimes headlights play tricks out there, refracting in the mirrors. I turned up the radio, tapped my fingers on the steering wheel, tried to focus on the broken white lines flashing beneath me, but every time I glanced back, that light was there. Not swaying, not moving closer or farther, just following. After maybe 10 miles, I started to get nervous. I turned off onto County Road 47, a smaller stretch I sometimes used as a shortcut. Usually, I never saw another soul on it at night. I figured if it was a car behind me, I'd see it turn too, and that would at least make sense. But when I made the turn, the light followed. Same distance, same height, same steady brightness. That's when I really started to feel it in my gut. Something was off. I told myself it could be a helicopter. The National Guard base wasn't that far away, but there was no sound. I rolled down the window just to be sure, and all I heard was the wind rushing by and the tires on asphalt. No thumping blades, no engine hum, just silence. I drove another couple of miles, heart thudding the whole time, until I finally pulled off onto the shoulder. I figured if it was a car or truck, it would pass me. I even turned on my hazard lights so they'd see me clearly, but nothing happened. I sat there, engine idling, watching my mirrors. The light was gone, not fading into the distance, just gone. No headlights, no glow, nothing but black road stretching behind me. I remember getting out of the car, thinking maybe I'd see taillights far down the road or some sign of what I'd been following. But the highway was empty in both directions. Just me, my car, and the sound of crickets in the fields. The air smelled like cut hay, and the sky was cloudy enough that I couldn't even see the stars. I stood there longer than I probably should have, scanning the sky and the fields, trying to spot anything unusual. Nothing moved. No lights, no shapes, no sound. Eventually, I got back in the car and kept driving, forcing myself not to look in the mirrors more than I had to. My hands were tight on the wheel and my foot felt heavier on the gas. By the time I hit the outskirts of Jamestown, I was shaking. Every stoplight felt like forever. sitting exposed in the dark with my rearview mirror reflecting nothing but my own brake lights. I pulled into my driveway and just sat in the car for a while, engine off, staring through the windshield. I told myself I must have been overtired, or maybe my mirrors caught a reflection from something. But I know what I saw. That light followed me for miles, steady and deliberate, and then disappeared the moment I tried to face it. Even now, when I drive that stretch at night, I catch myself checking the mirror more than I should, always half expecting that same white glow to be there, hanging at the edge of the darkness, waiting. It started raining hard enough that the porch light pooled on the boards. We sat there anyway, me with my beer and Jess with her mug of tea, because the storm had the kind of start that wants watching. Sheets of rain, low black clouds, little bursts of wind that sent leaves skittering across the yard. Our neighbor's porch light 2 houses down flashed like a lighthouse, and the old willow by the fence bowed like a tired animal. It was one of those late summer storms that smelled of hot asphalt and wet earth, the air thick and heavy and full of the kind of sound that presses at your ribs. We'd had a long week. I think that was part of why the thunder felt like company. Sitting on the porch with the storm made the house feel safer, somehow. Jess put her hat over her hair and sipped her tea. I kept my eyes on the sky, the way I always do, even though there's nothing special about me in clouds. The first crack came close enough that the porch boards vibrated under us. The transformer down the block hiccuped, and a chunk of the street went dark. And for a second, all the little televisions in the row houses cut out, and the world went quiet, except for the rain. Then the lights blinked back, and the neighbor muttered something about the power being unreliable this month. A few things were off from the normal storm pattern. Small, little things I would have shrugged off on their own. The frogs at the pond that usually sang like a far choir were subdued, more like a handful of hesitant notes than their usual chorus. The neighbor's Labrador, who liked to make theater of storms, had been barking a lot earlier and had suddenly gone still. When I glanced over, his porch light showed him standing, frozen mid-bark, silhouette like a statue. The porch light above us dimmed twice in a slow, deliberate blink. Jess noticed the odd little details quicker than I did. She always does. "You see that?" she asked, nodding toward the horizon where lightning had been stitching white veins across the clouds. "I do," I said. I didn't mean anything by it, just noticing. We both leaned forward and watched how the sky tore open. Sometimes you can tell if a storm will move fast or linger, and this one felt like it was going to dance around a while. The first few bolts were typical. Bright, quick, with thunder answering a beat later. Our dog, Max, who'd sprawled with his belly to the rain on the porch rug, twitched his ears and settled again. Nothing dramatic. Then the flash came that didn't fade. It was in the part of the sky over the old mill field, a bright white that at first read like a normal strike. It lit the clouds up like someone had turned a spotlight on the undersides of a sheet. But instead of discharging and going away, it stayed. Not the afterglow you get from a nearby lightning strike, and not a flash that lingers because your eyes are adapting. This was a steady, flat, white brightness that hung in the bowl of sky. It had edges, almost a clean rectangle where the light dropped off and the clouds went back to their normal gray. It didn't flicker, it didn't crackle, and there was no thunder that corresponded to it. The storm kept roaring around it. Rain-swept edges, other flashes, the distant roll, but that patch of light simply remained. Jess and I both said something like, "Huh," at the same time and leaned closer to the railing. A part of me expected it to blink out. Part of me expected thunder. It did neither. We watched in the way people watch a cat do something mildly indecent. Curious, uncomfortable, half expecting it to be normal if you squint. For a while, there were a lot of small misalignments stacked on top of each other. The clock on the microwave, Jess has the habit of setting the kitchen clock for dinner, jumped forward 10 seconds and then back. Max, who usually hates thunderstorms and either panting or hiding, lay with his chin on his paws and didn't move at all, eyes half closed like he trusted the light for some reason. My phone buzzed with a notification from the weather app that the radar showed nothing unusual beyond typical storm cells. The app's map had a pause in the loop for maybe 5 frames. and then it resumed as if caught in a cough. I told myself my brain was weaving patterns where the right answer was simple malfunction and fatigue, and Jess gave me one of those looks that means she's filing that excuse for later. We kept watching. A barn owl on the other side of the field called, then paused mid-hoot, as if someone had cupped a hand over its beak. The sound stopped and the world around us kept making storm noises, but the animals went quiet like a curtain had fallen. Overhead, the steady patch of light did not waver. It didn't look like the storm, no jagged branches of lightning, no branching tendrils, just a slab of bright that erased stars behind it and made the cloud edges glow like tissue paper. At one point, Jess stood up to get a better view, and the porch light above the door flickered right in time with the ripple of rain across the railing. We both laughed nervously, and she muttered, "Probably a fuse," but her fingers tightened on the railing like she wanted the solid wood under her to prove the world was still ordinary. For a few minutes, nothing happened, and then a blackout affected 3 houses down the line, and the only illumination on the block was that still patch of sky. The contrast made it feel more deliberate, like something had placed a lamp above the field and left it there. I told myself to call someone. City services, the radio station, a friend. I didn't. The noise of the storm and the way the neighbor's car alarm had started and stopped made the idea of getting up and into the rain feel like an admission that the night had become something else. Jess squeezed my arm. "Do you think it's a flash that's just stuck?" she asked. She sounded like she was asking about a stuck light bulb, like that would make it explainable. "Maybe a camera flash," I said, because it was the first boring thing my mind produced. I told myself I'd get the binoculars. I found the small folding pair in the kitchen drawer, wiped the lenses on my shirt, and leaned over the railing. Through the binoculars, the light had a texture to it I didn't expect. It wasn't just white, like sunlight. It had a softness, like cloth or velvet, pushed up against the clouds. It obscured the stars where it sat, but there was no motion through that luminance, no movement of the cloud bank behind it. It looked absurdly like someone had painted a patch of sky with a roller. We kept watching it because there was nothing else to do but watch. The storm moved around it. Lightning struck closer a couple of times, and that thunder made the boards under our feet tremble. But the plain white stayed. Clouds rolled past the edges of it, thin and fast like paper wind, and when the clouds passed, the light remained. That is, the cloud would cover the bright patch, and the bright patch would still be visible through the cloud. A dimmer, paler ghost, like something behind glass. Then the cloud would move, and the patch would be just as bright as before. After maybe 15 minutes, a crow flew across the yard, cackling its usual complaint. And when it passed in front of that light, it threw a hard black silhouette against the white. The bird's shadow cut through the brightness, and for a second it felt like something else, like there was volume to the light, like it could be interrupted by matter. The crow did a weird twitch, as if it had been startled by passing through a different kind of air, then flew off. There was a smell that I can't name properly. Not ozone, not rain, but something like the sharp tang you get right before a thunderstorm if you stand too close to a struck wire. Jess said she smelled it too, and we looked at each other like that, established the sensory fact more solidly than just one person noticing. The smell passed quickly. The light did not. At some point, the radio in the kitchen, which we'd left on for station updates, found a weak AM signal, and for a second a voice came through. Some late-night host talking about traffic and commuter warnings. The voice stumbled as if cut by interference, and then music filled the kitchen. A soft old song I hadn't heard in years. The song was muffled like it was being played underwater. The voice stopped. The song looped a second bar, and then the radio went dead again. It stayed dead. When Jess went to check the circuit box, everything read normal. The only thing flashing was that rectangular white in the sky. Clouds thinned and thickened. The patch held. The rain eased and then came back harder. We watched our street go from dim to dim again as the storm clawed past. The whole time, the light stayed in place like a thing with patience. The hours of it were not long, maybe 40 minutes at the most, but because it ignored all the normal cues, it felt stretched. Finally, the clouds took a long, lazy roll, and the white slab started to blur at the edges. The wind picked up, and the willow bent down, and the owls started again, like a tape resuming. The light thinned and went almost translucent, like a picture in a window losing power, and then it snapped. There was no discharge, no racking thunder, no shower of sparks, just an absence. One moment white, the next the sky was ordinary, full of moving cloud walls and bursts of lightning that behaved exactly like storms do. The world exhaled as if someone had been holding it. We stayed on the porch for an hour after that, talking in low voices about nothing in particular. We made tea, put a throw over Max, and kept returning our eyes to the part of the field where the light had been. It looked like any other wet field. Puddles reflecting cloud, the fence line sagging. The neighbor's power came back fully around midnight, and my phone finally had signal bars and a dozen missed messages asking if we were okay because someone had seen the flash from across town. Jess scrolled through them slowly, not in a hurry to close out the feeling. That night, I slept badly. I woke a few times thinking of the bird's silhouette cutting the brightness and wondering why there had been no thunder when such a strong light persisted, why animals had fallen half asleep. In the morning, the storm had left the air washed and bright, and everything looked like it had been rearranged by the weather and put back the way it had been. I mowed the lawn without thinking, sipped coffee in the sunshine. The field where the light had been was just a wet field with flattened grass. I have 100 practical answers I can pull out. Camera flash, a military flare that hung in the cloud, some weird power issue with the transformer that directed light into the sky. Each one fails at some piece. The way the light blocked the stars without showing any discharge pattern, the lack of sound, the animal's odd behavior. I don't have a tidy ending to it. We went to work the next week, paid bills, watered plants. If you ask me what I saw, I'll tell you the truth. The sky, the light, the way a crow cut across it and looked like it passed through a sheet of paper. I won't tell you I know what it was. I don't. We just keep watching storms a little longer now, because once you notice that something in the sky can stop being ordinary, your eyes don't rest in the same way. I was halfway through tying on a new jig when the lake did something it had never done before. It was just before dawn, the kind of light that's more gray than anything else, and the mist lay close to the water like someone had spread a sheet over it. I'd launched the little aluminum boat out from my spot on the west shore, Green Hollow I call it, though the map has a different name, and I'd pushed out far enough that the bulrushes were a soft sound behind me. The oars rested across the thwarts. I was mostly there for the quiet, and for a line in the water that sometimes rewarded being patient. Before the weirdness started, there were small things that felt wrong if you noticed them. The crickets had stopped a little before I left. No steady background, just a weird emptiness where sound should be. The radio I keep in the cooler for weather reports had been picking up nothing but a thin hiss, and then a single music station that cut in and out. When I reached the boat ramp, the pickup's clock read 4:12, but the dash clock in my grandfather's old watch was stubbornly set to 4:07. I shrugged and told myself I'd set the watch wrong the night before. Out on the lake, the water was glass. No wind to wrinkle it, no motor wakes. I sat with my knees up and my jacket zipped, casting without energy because the fish had been slow the past week. Geese drifted at the far end, but they were unusually close to shore and clustered like they were huddling against something. When I lifted my head, the dogs from the cabin over the ridge started barking once, and then quieted as if someone had reached them with a hand. Small things, I thought, the sort of things you fold into the story you tell yourself when you want the world to remain sensible. I flicked the jig out, let the line run, and watched the little ripple the bait made and then fade away. No nibble. I set the rod down and took a slow sip of coffee from a thermos. The steam fogged in front of my face and then dissolved, and the sky over the opposite shore was the pale color of an old photograph. Then the reflection did it. It started with a soft curve running across the silver surface. No wind, no boat, nothing external to cause a wave like that. The ripple was broad and low, like something enormous had slid through the water an instant before my eyes. It moved in a long, slow sweep from my left to my right and smoothed out at the far bank as if someone had ironed the lake flat. The sound of it was a hollow, low thing that I felt through the soles of my feet even though I was sitting. For a second, I thought my oars had drifted, but they lay where I'd left them. The boat didn't rock. I blinked and looked up, more out of habit than expectation. The sky was empty. No plane, no cloud bank passing, no gull flapping through, nothing to explain the scale of the motion reflected beneath me. The sun was only a promise behind the mist. I watched the mist roll along where the ripple had crossed and looked back down at the surface. The reflection of the trees had shifted like a curtain had been pulled. It was the kind of movement that implies mass overhead, but the air above was a blank, a pale wash. My first reaction was practical and stupid. Maybe a log under the surface, big as a boat, drifting. I scanned the water. Nothing. The water around the ripple was clear, nothing bobbing, no disturbance except the sweep itself. Then the geese seemed to tense, and a single one let out a long, disappointed honk that wasn't like any call I know. The dogs over the ridge went from quiet to a single sustained bay, and then silence again. Small wrongs stacked inside the normal world and made the wrongness feel weightier. The radio's hiss went to a buzzing at the same tenor as the hollow in my chest. My phone, mostly a locator and emergency thing, had no bars at all, though the map told me there should be two. The wristwatch that had lagged was now 5 minutes slow against the pickup clock in the boat, and I couldn't for the life of me get it to catch up. I dug the watch out and reset it with fumbling fingers. The hands jumped a thin sliver and then kept the new time without complaint. It didn't feel like time was breaking. It felt like the instruments were agreeing to lie. I tried to find a source of the wave. I rode a steady foot toward the center, oars whispering, feeling ridiculous. The water gave me nothing. When I stopped rowing, the ripple returned in a faint echo, like a second pass, only smaller and arguably older. My skin had that prickly feeling you get when you think about something too long in the dark. I told myself to be reasonable. People in these parts blame ghosts for anything they can't name, and I didn't want to be that kind of voice in the diner, countryside that spins tales. But being alone with something you can't account for gets under you in a different way from being with people who will laugh it away. The lake felt tight, like a room with tall ceilings that amplifies the small noises. I kept expecting a motor sound, a boat around the far bend, someone to call out hello. Nothing came. After 10 minutes of setting lines and watching the water as if I could stare an explanation into being, there came another sweep. This one started directly under the boat and broadened outward in a clean circle, overturning the reflected sun and the bows until the whole patch of water seemed to tilt. The effect made the trees on the far bank look like they'd been shaken by a hand. The sound was deeper that time, an almost subsonic thud you felt in your molars. My heartbeat threaded up into something I noticed more by how my fingers tightened around the rod than by anything else. I stood up like a fool and squinted at the sky through the mist. The mist rolled with nothing inside it. I moved not because I thought something would appear, but because the idea of being still felt dangerous, as if I were a specimen in a jar. For a second, I considered calling someone. Frank across the road, the game warden, but my thumb found the phone and there was still no signal. I thought of the stupid list of plausible things again. A low-flying maintenance craft, an experiment at the remote airfield 2 counties over. None matched the traffic-free rise and the deep, pressure-like sound beneath my feet. Maybe 20 minutes passed. The sun began to thin the mist just enough that I could see the far bank clearer, the sand pale and the reeds edging like a comb. The lake took on a bit of day. The world outside the ripple returned to the usual score. Birds starting to call in small pitches, a dog barking in town, and then apologizing with a yelp. I thought the thing had stopped. Then I saw the wake. It wasn't a wake from the surface, but from something suggested beneath. A long, pale line, like a shadow cast at the edge of the water, slipped quietly across the reflection of the shore. It moved at a steady pace, no turbulence, no foam, just a discontinuity in the light. It passed under the boat, and the boat felt lighter, as if a vacuum had been tugging it up. The hairs on my arms stood up. I remember thinking that if I put a hand in, I would feel a pressure, and the notion of touching that pressure made my palms slick with sweat. I yanked the line in and shoved the rod under the seat. I thumbed the starter on the little outboard. Nothing. The choke moved. The engine coughed a single weak sound and then died, as if whatever had been carrying the sound away had decided not to return it. The boat sat level. I thought about rowing in a panic, but my arms felt slow, like they belonged to someone else. I slid the oars into the locks and pulled at them with force I didn't think I had. They moved, but the motion was greasy, reluctant, as if the water itself resisted being parted. I remember the float plan I never filed. It seemed suddenly stupid. I had my keys and my wallet and a sweater. No gun, like an idiot. Nothing. Panic has a slow thumb. It doesn't always rush. Mine made a list of small actions and crossed them off in order. Start engine. No. Row. Slow. Call. No signal. Wait. My least favorite option of the moment. Waiting felt like the least cowardly thing I could do because whatever this was, stalking the water in silent arcs, it hadn't rushed me. It moved in a patient economy that made me feel like an intruder in someone else's plan. After a long minute, the ripple under the boat slackened. The sky had the color of washed denim, and a heron beat huge wings and lifted off the far reed with a lazy curse. The dog across the ridge barked and actually sounded pleased to do so, and the world outside my little boat returned its small, ordinary noises as if someone had turned the dial back in the other rooms of the house. The engine turned over and caught as if shame had been lifted from it, and the radio found a station with a man talking about road construction. My phone slid back to a single bar and then two. My watch, which I had been watching as if it were a ritual, read a time I didn't trust. I rowed back in slow strokes. I didn't rush. The oars caught the water with a sloppier rhythm than normal, and I counted my breaths. Each bank of reeds seemed like a checkpoint. When I slid ashore, the mud sucked at my boots and seemed normal, absurdly normal in texture. I hauled the boat up and tied the painter, fingers stiff. The truck was where I left it. The keys were hanging from the same hook. I drove home on the cabin road with the window down and the cab smelling like coffee and damp canvas. I tried to tell the story at the diner over eggs, because people who know you will either take the weird thing and fold it into their morning, or plant it like a seed and watch what grows. The waitress listened with the sort of half smile you give the guy who has a fishing tail. I could see where she was deciding whether to laugh me off. Frank, who always listens to the AM radio in the truck, said his line was a little off that morning too. He'd thought it was geomagnetic or some damn thing. By the time I got home, I had the bony feeling in my chest that's like being tired without having done the work. I put the boat in the shed and left the key on the peg. I sat on the back steps with a second mug of coffee and watched the lake through the trees. The surface was ordinary. Wind-blown fingers of ripple, a flap of goose wings. Somewhere a child laughed, and the sound hit the air like a normal thing. That afternoon, I checked the phone photos. In a handful of frames, the water had a strange, indistinct smear where nothing should be. In others, the metadata showed a gap of 3 minutes between shots that I didn't remember. I scrubbed through them until my thumb hurt and then put the phone down and did the sensible thing. Mowed the lawn, fixed a loose post, called my sister to ask a question about her cat. I can't explain the ripple. I don't have a neat picture of a cause. What I have is an impression. The lake acted briefly like the top layer of a book someone else was reading from the inside, and I had peered at the page. It left me with my watch slow by minutes, my radio fuzzy, and a line in my head I can't undo. I slept in my own bed night and woke in the morning to the routine of making coffee, feeding the cat, and checking the mailbox. The lake was where it had always been when I drove by. The same small glitter and the same quiet. I told Frank again because there's comfort in saying the words aloud and in the way a friend will nod without making them sound like proof. That night, the moon was thin and high and the sky looked right. I lay on the couch and watched through the window, half expecting a repeat. Nothing came. The lake stayed a dark, sensible shape on the edge of town, and I went to bed because I had to. I turned off the highway and onto the long gravel drive because that route was faster than fighting Main Street traffic at that hour. The clouds had been coming down all day, low and tired, and by the time I passed the last cornfield, it was dusk that blurred the distance into a single gray smear. My name's Alex Cortez. I drive for a courier company, and I know dozens of drives by sight and by feel. This one, Route 12, house setback maybe half a mile, was one I'd done twice a month since spring. People out here like the privacy. They liked not seeing anyone until they had to. Before the things that made me slow down, small annoyances had been stacking in my cab. The CB crackled like it always did when a diner's radio leaned into the same band. A message from dispatch came through thin and delayed. My GPS gave me a little hiccup at the turnoff, spun in place for a heartbeat before finding the drive. The truck's radio lost the station and filled the cab with a soft white hiss until I thumbed the dial. I did those quick things without thinking, retuned, checked the mirror, eased off the gas so the gravels didn't spray like glass. The drive itself is mostly a long, soft climb between pines that smell like wet wood and the damp dust that road crews leave when they grate a shoulder. It was quiet in that country way, only the sound of the tires and the occasional drip from a tree. Midway up the drive, the headlights caught a motion. The metal gate at the entrance, slightly ajar, moving as if a car had just passed through. No cars were coming or going. The gate creaked once and sat still. I told myself the wind had tugged it. The wind did that sometimes, a lazy hand through the branches. I saw the house lights next. The 3 flood lamps mounted under the eaves, the path lighting, a single porch light over the door. From far away, they looked like steady beacons, the usual kind of suburban safety glow. As I pulled within 50 yards, the lamps started to stutter. Not the slow bulb dying kind of flicker, but quick, neat blinks that made the whole front face of the house look like a staccato of white squares. I eased the truck to a stop because something in me wanted to watch them. Motion sensors are temperamental in rain, I thought, or the owner's electrical system was on the fritz. I killed the engine and the truck went all quiet. The blinks settled into a rhythm. 2 quick flashes, a beat, 1 long flash, a pause, like a hand tapping. For a few seconds, I sat there and listened. My breath fogged the window a little. My dashboard clock ticked 6:08 p.m. The CB picked up a momentary voice and then nothing. The static returned like an exhale. I reached for my phone out of habit to log the delivery, and it showed 1 bar, even though this route usually has 3. The mail slot in the screen showed the app 2 green dots. Delivery confirmed. And then it cut to gray like it hadn't gotten the signal. I watched the lights for a long breath. They blinked again and then steadied into a constant glow, as if something inside the house had decided to behave. I felt that relief you get when an oddity resolves itself, stupid, human relief, and opened the door to step out. The gravel crunched under my boots and the air smelled of cold earth and a wood stove someone had started earlier. I had the small brown package for the back bedroom in my hand, and I should have gone straight to the porch, knocked, taken a picture of the door, and called it done. Instead, I kept stealing glances up. Above the house, where the pines edged the property, something pale moved slow and low. At first, I thought it was an early fog bank, a pale smear of mist drifting across the treetops. Then it held a shape long enough for me to see that it was a soft, washed-out glow, not a sheet of cloud. It crossed the sky in a straight slide, like a lantern on a string, but without any tether. The color wasn't the harsh white of headlights or the warm orange of sodium lamps. It was something like diluted moonlight, a pallid, even wash that made the upper branches look as if they'd been painted over. It moved without sound. The normal sounds of the property, an old Airstream's refrigerator humming down the neighbor's lot, a dog's mutter, continued as if nothing overhead had entered the frame. I called out, "Hello?" More reflex than expectation, because at that hour, people often heard you before they opened the door. No answer. The steps to the porch were solid under my feet. The package felt heavier than it was, like a thing that matters. I set it down near the mat and leaned on the rail to get a closer look at the sky. The glow glided slow behind the trees and then paused over the maple on the east side, like someone had laid a lamp there and left it. I could see the leaves in that glow in a way my headlights never showed, thin and every edge caught. When I looked back at the house, the porch light was steady, not blinking, not pulsing, The same steady, proper porch light that says, "I'm home and aware." The flood lamps at the eaves hummed on as if to reassure the world, but the contradiction felt taut in the cold air. I blinked and rubbed my thumbs together because my hands were going numb. I kept expecting a sound to explain the sight. A helicopter would have a characteristic chop. A low-flying crop duster makes a reedy, mechanical whisper. There was nothing. The glow had the same absence about it that happens when a window opens to an empty room. It was there and not there in the same split breath. A small thing tugged at the edges. My delivery scanner, the device I used to register drop-offs, had a soft green ring that pulsed and then froze. The timestamp on the screen reads 6:05, even though my dash clock read 6:10. I swore out loud, which startled the nearby cat that had decided to patrol the porch. It arched and slunk into the shadow of the eave. The rhythm I'd seen in the lights returned, 2 quick flashes, a space, 1 long, and then silence. The glow had moved along lazily toward the south, trimming the tops of the firs like a hand smoothing a blanket. I wanted to take a picture. That's the way people try to convert strange things into proof. My phone camera came up, framed the house and the pale smear above, and the image looked like a smear on the screen. When I zoomed, the screen froze for a second and then went black. My phone chirped a small, unhappy sound and then displayed the message, "Camera unavailable." I felt suddenly ridiculous, mumbling apologies to an app that couldn't feel them. The house's front door opened a crack, then a glimmer of movement in the lit rectangle. A woman's face, older than I'd expected from the window reflection, peered out. She blinked, saw the package, and then smiled a quick, tired smile. "Thank you," she called, voice small and practical. I handed the slip and she took the package without coming fully out. She watched my face for a beat. I told her, clumsily, about the lights and the glow. She said, "Noticed it earlier. I thought it was a lantern or someone's work light. Thought the bulb was dying." She laughed, not unkindly. "Kids prank each other out here. Long weekend." She shut the door before I could ask more, and the click of the deadbolt sounded like a full stop. By the time I walked back to the truck, the glow had slipped along the treetops and was gone, like someone had rolled a sheet up into a tube and pulled it away. The house lights were steady. The gate at the driveway was closed, in its original position, with soft dew on the chain. The scanner hummed back to life and registered the delivery with the proper time. Everything in the world lined up again like a garment smoothed. The truck started with a smooth rattle, and I steered down the gravel crunch, thinking the whole thing would fold into the day, the way strange things often do. An odd note you hum for a while and then forget. But before the end of the drive, another oddness caught me. At the pullout where the maples thin, the headlights cut through a thin wall of mist, and in the reflection on the wet road, the headlamp beam looked wrong, stretched like a rubber band. My dash clock ticked 6:18, then leapt back to 6:12, like the hands had decided to run late for no reason. My phone had a voicemail from dispatch that was just static when I opened it. I sat at the light just a moment longer and listened to the hum of the radiator fan and the wind. An old woman walked her terrier 2 lots over and didn't look up. The ordinary choreography of the night had resumed. I finished my route that night the way I always do. Keep your head, keep the manifest straight. Take the next left when you come to it. I mentioned the light to Sam at the depot in a half-joke. He raised his eyebrows and said he'd done a rural run near the county line last month and seen a pale disc over a farmhouse. The conversation moved on to broken pallets and traffic like it always does. In the break room, the TV showed a weather radar clearing a weird artifact, then moving on. No big story flagged. No one called the dispatcher to say something's out there. At home later, I lay awake longer than usual. I replayed the driveway in my head. The gate that might have moved in the wind, the lights that blinked like a code, the pale glow that slid and then vanished. I checked my scanner's log again, noting that for a moment the timestamp and the GPS coordinates had been a hair off. I packed the route notes away for the next day and told myself the practical things. A faulty sensor, an odd reflection off low clouds, kids with flashlights. Each possibility felt as tidy as Band-Aids over a bruise. I'm back on Route 12 now on a morning run, and I check that driveway more carefully than I ever have. The house sits the same, Lawn, mailbox, swing on the porch. The lights burn steady. Sometimes when I pull up, I'll stand for a second by the cab and look up at the trees, half expecting the pale wash to slide past again. Mostly there's nothing but the insulated hum of the world getting on with itself. But I noticed last week that my scanner's clock had been a minute fast for no good reason, and that the gate had a scuff where my bumper would have been if someone had ever towed it. Small things pile up. You notice them or you don't. I'm just telling how I noticed that night and what I saw, because when you drive for a living, you notice things, even the ones that don't fit neatly into the boxes on your manifest. I noticed the silence before I noticed the fog. I was on Route 9, the long commuter road I'd taken for 3 years. And it was one of those late October mornings where the air felt like someone had left a damp blanket over the world. The wipers kept their lazy rhythm and the heater hummed, but the radio, which I usually had low and pointless, was a dead hiss of static when I turned it on. I flipped through stations and nothing stuck, just noise. That should have been the first small thing to shrug off. What pushed at me was that I hadn't seen another car in 10 minutes, then 20, then 30. The road normally had a trickle. Commuters, a delivery van, someone with a crossing guard sign strapped in the back of their truck. This morning there was only me and a gray ribbon of asphalt disappearing ahead. I glanced in the rear view every couple of minutes without meaning to. The way you check the stove at home, and the mirror kept showing empty road. No headlights, no taillights, not even a flash of somebody's morning jogger or dog walker. The absence felt bad in my chest, in the way a skipped heartbeat does. I took the exit for the Ridgeview bypass because the fog looked thicker ahead and I wanted something closer to the ground than the long hill up top. The trees leaned in over the shoulder like a hallway. The fog was the kind that turned the world into a painting. Everything softened. My headlights cut a short cone in front of the car and showed wet leaves flying past like confetti. The GPS, usually so comforting, had a little spinning wheel in the corner and the map froze. I tapped the screen and it stuttered back. Then the little blue dot jumped a half-mile ahead like someone had dragged it. The time on the dash flicked forward a minute, then back. Small, wrong things stacking up into teeth. I slowed and thought about turning around, but I didn't. The road had a routine, and routines are the safe places you stand when strangers come for the edges of the map. As I drove, other oddities threaded through the minutes. A flock of starlings that usually roosted in the big sycamore was gone. No rustle, no flap. My phone buzzed, and when I glanced down to read the text, it had a timestamp that said 7:12 a.m., but the dashboard clock said 6:58. I told myself whoever texted me was on a different tower. I told myself a lot of ordinary things to make the weirdness manageable. At mile marker 17, I saw a glow over the tree line. It was far, maybe a half-mile away, and at first I thought it was headlights caught in low cloud. The light was too steady for headlights, though. It didn't have the sting of a bright passing beam. It was soft-edged and white, like a lamp through milk. Then I saw there were 3 of them, no bigger than the full moon as seen with the naked eye, arranged in a rough triangle and hovering, not drifting with the wind. They held their positions like someone had taped little lamps into the sky. If you had asked me seconds later what I expected, police helicopter, flares, some early morning construction, I would have given you a reasonable list. The orbs didn't match any of it. They hung silent. There was no rumble of rotors, no smell of fuel. The fog muffled the world into a pillow, so even the small sounds that sometimes define a place, distant train horns, a farmer backing up a trailer, were gone. I pulled off at the next turnout because I wanted to watch them without speeding. The turnout was a little gravel patch. A couple of benches overlooked the trees, and the air was so thick that when I stepped out, it felt like stepping into a shower. My breath came small and visible for the first time of the season. I left the engine running and turned off the heater because I wanted only what the world offered me without the car's noise soughing over it. From the turnout, they were clearer. 3 pale discs of light in a triangle, maybe spaced like the corners of a small roof. They didn't twinkle. They didn't move much. Just the tiny, precise nudge you see when a person adjusts their head. I took off my gloves to pull my phone out and photograph them because evidence is a useful little ritual. I did what I always do: open the camera, frame the sky, hold my breath. The screen showed a washed rectangle and one faint smear where the lights were. Then the image froze for a second and filled with pixels like somebody threw gravel across a lawn. When it cleared, the orbs were still there in the viewfinder, but the thumbnail after I snapped looked like a dark rectangle with nothing bright in it. My phone flagged the photo file as corrupt when I tried to open it. While I was kneeling by the hood with my phone, a truck pulled up silently behind me, a big older guy in a blue cap. He sat there for a moment and didn't get out. "You see that?" he asked through the driver's side window, his voice thick with sleep. He had that slow, practical cadence of someone who's up before dawn by necessity. I told him I did. He said he'd been coming this route for years and hadn't seen anything like it. He reached down and turned his CB on, and the static flared like a mosquito swarm, and then, as if someone had pinched the speaker, the CB went dead. We watched, two strangers with coffee and the breath of the fog between us, and the three lights stayed. They made no sound. The trees stood like a fence beyond them. The trucker said, "Maybe a balancer for the power lines, some company testing," which made sense in the way people need things to make sense. But there was no pickup of crew trucks on the shoulder, no blinking orange cones. He'd grumble about the new wind farm up on Oak Ridge and how it'd been playing hell with his routes lately, but his words felt like wishful lumber. A small animal darted across the gravel, some kind of rabbit, then froze at the edge of the tree line and sat on its haunches, watching the sky. The rooster at a farmhouse far off gave one long call and then stopped like a string had cut. There was a stillness that was not simply quiet. It felt like a cavity opened in the day where sound had been stored. After maybe 10 minutes, minutes measured by my wristwatch, which seemed to be the only thing humming a steady tune, the rightmost orb went dim, then bright again, then simply flickered out like someone squeezed the bulb. The other two held on. The trucker cursed soft and mashed the cigarette in his palm. I felt, frankly, dumb. I wanted a clear line, searchlight, weather balloon, an explanation I could fold and put on my shelf. The world doesn't like questions that don't have drawers to keep them in. By the time we both climbed back into our vehicles and eased onto the road again, the fog had thinned a hair. From the car, with the heater warm on my knees, the orbs looked farther away, as if the same air that had made them look close had also been a lens. At the second bridge, where you can usually see the river below and the lights of the mall in the far distance, they were gone. Not faded into ground haze, not whisked off with a gust, absent. The sky was a lighter gray, the treetops just treetops. I checked the rear view, and the road behind me was empty again. No truck, no other cars. My phone buzzed, a single text from my sister asking if I'd gotten to work yet, and the timestamp matched my watch for the first time that morning. All that afternoon, the memory sat in my chest like an unfiled receipt. At work, I told one coworker to breathe air into it, and she laughed in a careful way and said to email security about the fog warnings. Later, over coffee, my sister texted back. Someone at the diner mentioned things in the sky by the ridge, and another friend admitted she'd seen a single bright light the night before that had hung and then gone. Small confirmations that didn't stitch together. The photos I'd taken were a mess on my phone. Glitches and blocks, and one frame where the sky had been a smear like someone dragged a finger through paint. It's been a week. I drive the same way home. I check the rear view more than I used to. Sometimes, on the clear nights when the sky is full of stars, I find myself pulling onto the shoulder and looking toward the tree line, waiting politely for something to explain itself. Mostly there's only the normal stuff. The yellow of a restaurant sign, the distant flash of a billboard, the steady choreography of commuters finding their lanes. The world resumes its small, dependable habits and leaves me holding the odd corner of morning. I don't know what those three lights were. I don't have a neat explanation, and none of the small, ordinary answers really fit what I saw, the way they held their positions, the silence, the way my phone refused to behave the minute I tried to make the thing permanent. All I have is the memory of how the fog stuffed the morning full of hush, and how three small points of light hung above the trees, like a question someone had left where I had to pass. I made it to work, I made it home. I told a few people. The rest of the day was ordinary. Lunch, a meeting, emails. Life went on around that tiny refusal of sense, and I learned something small and honest: how quickly the world will fold itself back into routine, even when the sky does something it isn't supposed to. The power went out like someone had dropped a blanket over the street. I noticed it first because my fan died. 1 second, the kitchen was breathing that slow, low hum that keeps a summer night from feeling like a sauna. The next second, it was just me and the clock on the microwave, frozen at 11:12 and dark. I set my mug down and looked up, thinking it was our house only. Circuit tripped, a breaker popped, until the neighbor's porch light across the way blinked once, and then everything on our block went black at the same time. For a minute, there was that tight half second where your brain calibrates and says, okay, candles, phone, check the fridge. Then the world rearranged itself into the small modes we use when the grid disappears. Flashlights, phone screens, car lights. People came outside in bare feet and robes. A few kids shrieked and laughed because it felt like an unscheduled sleepover. The air smelled like the street after a thunderstorm, though no rain was falling yet. Hot concrete and the thin dust the city kicks up. I grabbed my phone, thumbed the flashlight on, and stepped out onto my stoop. Mrs. Lee from next door was already leaning over her fence, hair in a towel, holding her phone up like a candle. "Power's out," she said as if that were news. "Everything?" I shrugged. "Looks like it." Kevin from 2 houses down came out in his work boots and a grim, practical face that said he'd been dealing with outages in his building for years. He walked around, hit the side of his breaker box with a flat palm like he was starting a stubborn engine. Phones spat text messages that were more vibes than data. "You good?" "Yep." "Power?" "Out," in little green bubbles popping across the dark. I went and opened the back door and called for Sadie, our dog, because in blackouts, dogs get theatrical. She trotted out and sat, solemn, sniffing the air. The first few minutes were easy, like a cheap movie. We all stood on our lawns, neighbors clustered in small islands of light, and traded small facts. Who had candles, who had a gas stove they could light, who had Cal's portable radio, Cal being the local guy who always had stuff. People called the power company on speaker and got the standard "we're working on it" message that meant nothing at midnight on a summer night. There were little wrong things as the blackout settled. My neighbor's old fridge started to whir in the next door yard, its motor trying to catch up once and failing, then stopping. A distant dog barked 3 times, then quieted like someone pressed mute. Street sounds thinned out. The city lived in pockets of light and sound, and we were suddenly in a pocket where the sound was soft and the waiting was loud. We were milling there maybe 15 minutes when the first light showed up. Not from the grid, not from a plane. It was above the maples at the far end of the block, a pale pulse that looked almost like a heartbeat through the thin haze. It was soft at first, like somebody had a flashlight and was waving it gently far away. But then another pulsed beside it, and then another, and then a slow ring of lights unfolded across the sky like fingers. It wasn't a string or string lights. The lights hovered in the air, not attached to anything I could see. They were white, but not the cold LED white you get from Blinkies in the mall. More like the inside of a bulb that hasn't been wired to a house yet. They pulsed in a slow, steady pattern. On, dim, off, then on again. Not random exactly, but not mechanical either. Watching them felt like watching someone give Morse code in a language you half knew. People's faces changed when they looked up. You could hear the breaths, even above the quiet. Somebody pulled out a camera, and the little red record dot blinked bright in the dark. I held my phone up too, because that's what we do, we document. The video on my screen showed black sky with specks, like the phone's sensor was trying and failing, but when I zoomed in, the image stuttered and smeared, as if the pixels didn't know whether to hold the light or reject it. The oddities piled. A neighbor's motion sensor lamp a few doors down pinged on and then went off again, perfectly in sync with 2 of the pulsing lights above. Mrs. Lee's hearing aid gave a soft chime when 2 of the pulses lined up above our roofs. I could see Kevin's ears twitch. He had that look of a man lining up facts in his head to make a plan, but he had nothing to plan for. We were outside, and together in that unusual way neighbors are when the normal scaffolding of a day collapses. Nobody wanted to say the obvious thing out loud. Instead, there was the kind of conversation you have when no one really knows what's happening. Soft hypotheses whispered like they were fragile. Drones? A light show? Helicopter? No one could hear helicopter rotors, and when someone joked about drone shows, they sounded unsure whether to be amused. The lights didn't move like drones. Drones have edges and sound. These lights kept their spacing, back like a sentence written across the sky. There was a hum, later. Thin, subsonic, more felt than heard. I only noticed it when a couple of the kids on the block stopped skittering and climbed onto the low wall to watch quietly. The hum was so low it made the hairs on my arms stand up. It was like the feeling you get in your teeth when you drive under high voltage lines. Not loud, just a presence. Not everyone agreed. People in the cluster near the mailbox said they heard nothing, or that their dogs did, or that their teeth buzzed. The way things split, what one person noticed and another did not, made the whole night feel like a shared dream with different memories. After about 20 minutes, the pulsing got more complex. The lights began to form patterns, moving from single dots to arcs, then to slow rotations. Some of them blinked twice in tandem, sending an odd ripple across the block where every porch light sensor jerked as if someone had tapped the circuit. On the next house over, a motion lamp flashed on, and the light slid like a drop across the yard in beautiful, impossible timing, with a ring 2 streets over. It felt choreographed in a way that made your stomach tighten. Kevin tried to call the municipal line. His phone line dropped to no service for a beat when he pressed speaker. He cursed, laughed, and kept trying. Someone called out that the grid itself had flickered in 1 or 2 places and stayed slumbering in others. We all had that feeling of small, private panic, where you imagine the oven timers lost and whatever needed refrigeration going bad tomorrow. Yet that practical panic sat beside a more childlike awe at the sky. At one point, I climbed on top of the trash can bin for a better angle. Don't judge, it worked, and watched a cluster of 5 lights expand into a ring and then collapse like a living thing breathing. Mrs. Alvarez had come out in her slippers and held a candle wrapped in wax like a talisman. She mouthed a little prayer that I didn't hear verbatim, but felt in the way her shoulders tightened and released. Nobody touched the lights. We watched them as if a human reaction might thin them, like blowing on a fire. I tried to take a long, rational breath. I did that math thing people do. Air traffic, satellites, remnant fireworks from a wedding downtown, only to be defeated by the simple fact that the pulsing matched no known pattern I could peg to a cause. They were precise enough that your brain wanted to call them deliberate, and delicate enough that you didn't want to impose that felt meaning onto them. Time lost its shape. Maybe 40 minutes passed, maybe a little over an hour. My phone said midnight at one point, and then 12:47 at the next check, like the minutes were getting stretched. At some point, Mrs. Lee asked me what time it was, because the clock in her head had confused itself. People started to settle into their spots, shoulders loose enough to be human again. The kids dozed off leaning on porch steps. The candle wax had sweated down a few inches. Then, as casually and suddenly as a hand flipping a switch, the world came back. The streetlight closest to our corner buzzed and flared. Then all the others woke up in a ripple that sounded exactly like a million tiny electrical sighs. The freezer's motor on my block gave a soft mechanical cough and returned to its even grind. The microwave's little clock blinked its normal nonsense, 12:48, and phones purred with 3 bars like nothing had happened. The hum in the air dissolved in a second. We all looked up. The lights were gone. The sky was a crowd of usual stars and the blank backplane of the city night. Empty, normal, stupidly ordinary. For a few seconds we stood there with the after image of the pulsing lights on our retinas and the neighborly noise returning. Someone turning a key in a lock, a dog running down the driveway. Conversation broke like waves, everyone suddenly eager to have been practical all along. A few people laughed, nervously. "Power back," Kevin said, like he was filing an incident report by speaking. A kid who'd been following the ring patterns like a study exercise said, "They're gone." Mrs. Lee dabbed her eyes with the edge of her towel, and I wasn't sure if she was wiping dew, smoke, or something like emotion. Somebody checked a local outage map on their phone, and there was no outage listed. The utility company's automated line said there were no reported interruptions in our area. The town app pinged an all clear. The notification felt thin. Discussion immediately split into the two standard camps: the ones who'd seen it and didn't want to let it go, and the others who'd missed chunks and were inwardly embarrassed to have been standing in their pajamas watching the sky. A couple of folks had shaky video and shared it in the group chat. The clips showed dark sky with pixel trails that made the pulsing look like bad reception. One of the kids had a good shot though. Stable, clear, and when he played it back, the pulsing was visible, smooth and patient, and then gone. We all watched the clip twice. The second time, the phone's screen hiccuped like the recorded light itself had been picky. We drifted back toward our houses, some lingering to talk, others to check the stove, the baby monitor, the coffee maker. I carried my mug of now cold tea to the kitchen, turned on the light, and stood with my hand on the counter for a long breath. The normal equally astonished me and annoyed me. My cat, who'd been pawing at the door like a trained sentry during the blackout, rubbed against my leg and then walked away, unimpressed. Later, sitting at the table with the house lights on and the fan grinding softly again, I replayed the night in my head like a movie. I could sketch the patterns, the order of the pulses, the way our porch light's motion detector had timed itself to the third blink of a ring, 3 houses down. I could recreate Kevin's face as he swore at the municipal hotline and the way Mrs. Lee's lips moved around something like thanks. But it felt wrong to assemble all those bits into a tidy story. The lights had been there. They had pulsed, then they had gone away when the power came back. Nothing blown a fuse, nothing explained, nothing left but a neighborhood with one more small, shared thing to tell at a barbecue. I slept badly that night. Windows open to the summer, listening for hums. The next morning, the block was normal. People cut grass, a mail truck clicked along, Mrs. Alvarez's kids dragged a hose across the lawn. Someone suggested we put a date on the community calendar. Sky Night, a rhyming joke, and Kevin said no jokes, maybe we should have cameras ready next time. We all agreed we'd check our lights, keep a battery pack, plan for freezer time, the reasonable checklist of living outside the grid. I don't have an answer. I still look up sometimes when the power dips, half waiting. Mostly, though, I've folded that night into the shelf of small things my town carries, like the time the old elm on 5th split in a windstorm, or the months with the raccoon that visited Mrs. Lee. It's a story I tell when someone asks about odd nights in this neighborhood, and people nod like they know what I mean. The human instinct to catalog the things that don't fit. We saw a sky that filled and emptied itself, and then we went back to trying to keep the milk from going bad. That's the thing about life. It insists on the ordinary, even when the sky doesn't. I slipped out the back door on tiptoe before the house woke up. It was late August, and the air sat warm against my skin. The kind of night when the heat stayed in the grass, and the road still smelled like the day. I shouldn't have been out. I'd promised my mom I'd be asleep by 10. But I'd been thinking about stars all week, about the way they looked in magazines and how Mr. Alvarez down the street kept saying the Milky Way comes out, the clouds don't show up. I took my dad's old binoculars from the top shelf in his closet and stuffed them inside my hoodie. They were heavy and smelled faintly of his aftershave. I didn't stop to worry about how dumb it looked. I only worried about making too much noise. The backyard was darker than I expected. The street light at the end of the cul-de-sac threw a cone of orange across the drive, but the rest of the yard dissolved into trees and the low shape of the compost pile. Crickets were loud enough to make my ears buzz, which is the noise I usually like when I want to think quietly. I lay back on the cool lawn and waited for my eyes to sketch the stars out of the black. A little while earlier, I'd thought I saw headlights on the road, a car going by every 10 minutes, like clockwork. That had stopped, though. When I've snuck out before, the whole sound pattern of the neighborhood has stayed steady. A dog at Mrs. Lane's, Mr. Alvarez's TV through the window. But tonight, the street was thinner, quieter. Even the trash can lids at the end of driveways didn't rattle when the breeze pushed them. I told myself none of that mattered. I'd been up too late studying, and maybe my head was primed to notice things it normally would not. I raised the binoculars and focused on a chunk of sky near the constellations the teacher called the Summer Triangle. Through the lenses, the stars had that close, stamped-on look like they were stuck to a glass pane. The binoculars gave depth to the dark, made the tiny clusters look like little cities. I breathed slow and kept looking, and then I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. There was a group of lights low and to the left, maybe third magnitude, and 3 of them nudged until they formed a neat triangle. Then more lights joined, like people finding seats in an auditorium, and they arranged themselves into a perfect circle. Not a wobble or an oval, a round, clean ring of lights, evenly spaced about the size of the full moon, as seen from the street. The circle hummed in the binoculars, steady and impossible in its symmetry. I lowered the binoculars and squinted. The spot of sky where the circle had been looked ordinary, full of random stars and a thin cloud toward the west. I raised the binoculars again. The circle was back, as if someone had taken a chalk and drawn it in the air. I laughed once, a nervous little sound, because the situation felt halfway between a magic trick and something I should be calling an adult for. I scanned around the ring with the binoculars so I'd be sure I wasn't seeing satellites or a plane. Nothing linked them together, just the ring, holding its shape like a floating wreath. I moved the binoculars a foot left and it shifted a hair. I jumped back to my original spot and it settled like it had been waiting for me to look properly. I tried a simple test. Blink faster, keep the lenses steady. The circle stayed put. I thought of my friend Ethan, who once posted a whole thread about drone light shows and how they were going to be the next big thing. But drones didn't sit perfectly still and arrange themselves into a flawless circle. Drones made buzzing noises and had little pauses when the battery needed management. This was quiet, unnervingly quiet through the lenses. Something on the street barked, a single sharp yelp, and then nothing. The bark felt like a punctuation mark, a reminder that normal things still happened. I told myself I'd seen this. Old binoculars, tired brain, a trick of clouds, and the way the eye focuses. I put the binoculars to my mouth like a tube and whispered, "Okay, come on, show me something else." When I looked back, the ring of lights had changed. Inside it, a tighter ring formed, 3 or 4 lights smaller and stepping into place. They weren't blinking like stars. They turned on with a soft, steady white that had no warmth to it. The inner ring rotated, a slow, deliberate spin that made my stomach do a little flip. It was motion unlike anything I'd seen. Not mechanical, not like a fan, but a movement that felt deliberate and patient. I reached out to record it on my phone, because people take pictures of everything, and phones have the convenience of proof. My hands shook, trying to get the phone out of my hoodie. When I hit record, the screen showed the same black dots I saw with my naked eye, nothing out of the ordinary. I lifted the phone to the binoculars, held it steady, and tapped the shutter. The photo came back just stars and a smear from the lenses. My phone's camera kept focusing and refocusing like it couldn't decide whether something was worth capturing. I cursed under my breath and tried video. The video recorded the ceiling of the sky as usual, no ring. When I played it back, there was a soft hiss under the audio, like wind in a tunnel that I hadn't heard in person. I lowered the binoculars again and sat up. For a minute, I talked myself into mundane reasons. Maybe they were a reflection from the street lamps, or some math that made stars look aligned if you squinted the right way. My mind reached for explanations like flotsam. Then the porch light at Mr. Alvarez's house, the one with the cracked globe, flickered twice and died. The house next door, where the McKinnons kept a motion sensor by the driveway, went click and stayed dark. Silence seemed thicker after that. Even the crickets sounded like they were a room away. I felt my scalp prickle, the sort of small, single-note worry that makes you stand up to see the horizon. I stood because staying prone felt like accepting an invitation to be watched. I crossed the lawn, barefoot, grass wet against my heels, and climbed onto the low fence to get a better angle. Up there, I could see further down the street between the maple trees. At the far end, the streetlight that usually flickers on at 11 was this time a steady globe of light. For a moment, I thought everything else would come back. Engines, televisions, the neighbor's argument that dissolves into laughter, but the world stayed thin and quiet. I put the binoculars up again. Through the lenses, the circle was prettier now, exact as a coin. The inner ring had stopped turning, and now the lights pulsed in a pattern, slow on, slow off, and the timing matched my heartbeat in a way that made me nauseous. I pulled the binoculars down to rub my eyes, and the pulsing light pattern dissolved like someone had spilled water over a chalk drawing. I brought them up again without breathing, and the circle was gone. For a second, my chest felt empty, in a way I had no words for. I was the only person awake on my block, and it occurred to me with an odd, childish panic that if I made too much noise, I might be interrupting something. I stood on the fence and scanned the sky with my naked eyes, practicing the old trick of tracing Orion's belt and finding the pointer stars. Nothing. The sky looked normal and grand and stupid with its flatness. I decided to test it. I took the binoculars and pointed them at the same patch of sky where I'd seen the circle, and then closed one eye and opened the other. The circle showed in the left eye view, and when I switched it to the right, it held. When I tilted my head a degree to the left, the circle elongated, a degree to the right, and it tightened. It was as if the thing preferred certain angles and punished others. I thought if I could find the precise spot, I could prove it to myself. I kept the binoculars steady, and the whole while my watch ticked. I looked down at it without thinking, 10 past 1. When I checked again, it said 10 past 2. My head did that slow, did I blink thing. I didn't remember the hour in between. The sky hadn't seemed to shift. The streetlights still burned the same steady color, but an hour had emptied of me. The missing hour tilted the night's balance from odd to something closer to alarming. Panic is a butterfly in your mouth. It's small and sudden. I climbed off the fence and ran, which was stupid. I ran toward the back door, even though I knew what would happen when my mom checked the clock and saw me. I heard nothing behind me, no tires, no one calling my name. The house smelled like warm bread and lavender. I slipped the binoculars under my bed and crawled in like I always did when I snuck back in, pretending to sleep until the morning. In the morning, I made coffee and half listened to the radio like I usually do. The morning traffic report said something about road work on Route 7 and a lot of talk about heat warnings. I almost told my mom. I almost told my dad. Instead, I said nothing. I made it a question in my head I could poke at later. Did I dream it? Did the binoculars bend the world to themselves? When I checked my phone, the photos I'd taken were empty sky and smudged lenses. The hour gap was there, black and plain on my watch. I didn't tell Ethan either. Kids don't keep strange things to themselves because they're scared of being wrong. They keep them because people will get bored. But when he texted in the afternoon about wanting to go camping somewhere away from the lights, I didn't say no. That night I took the binoculars back to the shelf. I left them there for a week. If I tell the truth, I stared at the spot in the sky where I'd seen the circle a few nights later and felt nothing happen. The world moved on. Leaf blowers, a car alarm, a late laugh, and the sky returned to being a scatter of lights that meant maps and not mysteries. Sometimes at 1 a.m., I find myself turning on the porch light and looking up, listening for a hum I can't name. Mostly there's nothing. Mostly the city keeps its routines and I keep mine, and the circle sits in my memory like a coin you can't quite catch. I went out before dawn because that's when the bass were willing to bite in the inlet. My name's Mason Reed. I run a little charter some summers and fish on the off days. That morning was raw and low-hanging with fog, the kind that makes the shoreline feel like it's been moved a few yards closer. I like mornings like that. They quiet the town down, and the only company is the gulls and whatever's breathing under the water. Little things were wrong from the start. I shoved off at 4:30, and the slip that usually squeaked when I lifted the throttle was quiet. The motor caught and idled like it always did, but the old dock lights didn't blink on with the same steady hum I was used to. They stuttered once, like a cough, then stayed dim. I told myself it was the bulb, the wiring, any excuse. Small repairs are part of being on the water. I ran a slow line out past the shoal and tuned the handheld VHF to the harbor channel. Static. The channel usually carried a tangle of other boats checking in, the ferry schedule if you squinted, and someone somewhere always had a story about a snagged lobster pot. That morning there was nothing but a thin hiss. I tried another channel. Same. It felt like being at sea, with the radio dialed to empty. At the mouth of the inlet, the bait schools were acting odd. Usually they scattered and flashed like quicksilver when you bring the engine too close. These ones held their place, tight and dense, like a tossed net pulled taut. The surface had a sheen to it I couldn't name, a pale oil-slick look, even though there wasn't any sheen on my boots when I climbed back aboard. The gulls that normally shrieked and dove were gone. One cormorant that usually sat on the channel marker took off in a single jerky flap and then vanished into the fog. No sound. That's the kind of thing that sets you on edge without you realizing it. Animals stop making patterns. I set my rods and let the boat troll. The depth finder chirped once and then the screen froze on a single echo line like someone had hit pause. It came back after a beat, the needle sliding down and then settling. Small glitches like that happen. Salt and a finicky wire. But every tiny failure felt like another note in the same odd song. By the time I rounded the point and the houses of the next cove blurred into the fog behind me, I had this mild pulsing feeling in the back of my neck that told me I was being watched by the wrong kind of attention. The weather sat like a blanket, then a breeze ripped through the cove and cut it tight, and that breeze did something else. It made the air taste metallic. I've been on the water a long time. I can tell when a squall's coming, when a bank of cold air's pushed down. This wasn't the same. The taste slid up the back of my throat and left a dry note like a hand had wiped away the gloss. Around 6:10, the sun was a pale smear, and the fog thinned into bands. That's when I saw the first white point. At first, I thought it was a reflection off something on the water, a buoy, a fisherman's headlamp. But the point rose, slow and deliberate, just above the surface about 100 yards ahead. It was bright enough to be a lamp and too steady to be a sparkle. It didn't change color or intensity. I watched the ripple from where it rose, and there were no waves, the surface smoothed under it, as if whatever came up had not disturbed the water in the way a body or a log would. Then two more rose, like someone had lifted 3 small moons out of the inlet and set them on strings. They moved up together, perfectly timed, and for a moment I thought of lanterns. They drifted straight up, quiet as a breath. The fog swallowed the lower halves of them, and their tops looked like coins against a gray sky. No sound, no hiss, no popping, nothing a generator would make. The cormorant's absence felt more meaningful than it had before. I killed the motor then because reflex told me to cut noise and watch. The boat bobbed, the only sound the water licking the hull. The white points rose until they cleared the top edge of the fog, and then they didn't continue in a straight climb. They tilted, as if riding a current I couldn't feel, and then they slipped sideways. They moved together, slow, like 3 identical birds, keeping the same spacing. A gull's wing beat would have sounded loud enough then, but the gulls were not there. My hands were numb, even though I had on gloves. I fumbled my phone out and tried to take pictures. The camera lens fogged up every time I brought it toward the sky. I remember that with a kind of petty annoyance of all the times to have a useless phone. I waved my hand in front of the lens and the picture showed the polished blur of droplets. When I zoomed in, it stuttered and my phone said the camera had stopped working. I swore out loud, which in that empty morning felt like profanity against the world. They climbed until they were above the fog layer and then they kept going. Not bright like the sun, more like an internal white, the same color as halogen but cleaner. The tops of them dissolved into the cloud bank. They didn't punch through it so much as sink into a softer gray. My mind tried simple things. Tethered balloons, research buoys with oxygen bubbles, a pile of illuminated jellyfish. Nothing fit that slow lateral slide once the white points were in the clouds. They didn't cast light on anything. They were not casting shadows. I thought of calling the harbor master, but the VHF still had that thin hiss, and my phone had only 1 bar. Even if I could get through, I wasn't sure what I'd say that would sound like anything but a gullible fisherman. 3 lights rose from the water and drifted into the clouds. Doesn't roll off the tongue in a convincing way. As they rose, something in the inlet changed. The water went very still, like the whole surface had been lacquered. My rod tip stopped twitching. Time acted weird. Not missing in a cinematic way, but like the slice of the day thickened. Clocks and instruments were still telling minutes, but the minutes didn't have the usual texture. I checked my watch, because that's the small practical thing you do. The second hand slid, and I felt a yaw in my brain, a sleepy, dislocated feeling. When I blinked, I realized I'd squinted a long time and an hour had passed according to the dial. It couldn't have. I'd watched the sun's rise and the tide edge, but my last memory of it was the white points hovering. The gap was a soft smear in my head I couldn't press my finger into. By the time I noticed the hour missing, the 3 had already slipped up into the cloud deck and vanished. Not fade, not climb away. 1 second visible, the next a cloud where they'd been. The fog closed in back to how it had been before I shoved off. When they were gone, the inlet didn't resume normal life so much as it rewound into a different quiet. The depth finder chirped like it had to clear its throat. The radio hiss returned to the same low noise it had been this whole morning. The gulls came back, but they came low and cautious, pecking along the waterline as if checking for bait. The school of fish broke into the surface and scattered like 100 thrown coins. The sense of being watched diminished, like a pressure eased off my shoulders. I cut the motor and idled toward the cove because my hands were shaking and I wanted land. On the way in a small boat was tied at a private float, the one the Thompsons use on weekends. No one was there, but their dog sat at the bow and held its head up, watching where the water met the sky. When I passed, he barked half a bark and then stopped, like someone turned his volume down. I waved at him because animals are simple and they sometimes give you something to rely on when the rest starts to wobble. By noon, I was back at the dock. I slid the boat on and carried the gear up, moving mechanically. At the bait shop, George was sweeping, and he looked up, asked if I'd had any luck. I told him what I saw because I needed to put the sentence in the air and have a human witness in earshot. George frowned and said, "You get out early, Mason. You probably saw one of those research floats or the Coast Guard testing." He didn't sound sure. The Coast Guard was doing nothing that morning. Their patrol log had a single entry, routine check in the harbor at 5 a.m., then nothing unusual reported. That evening, I sat on my porch with a beer and watched the sky, like maybe they'd come back and I'd spot them before they rose. Nothing ever came up out of the inlet again. The tide did its business, kids went out on jet skis, and the world performed its small, ordinary choreography. Sometimes late at night, I'd find myself walking to the pier and standing with my hands on the railing, looking for that clean white against the clouds. I never saw it again. I can give you the practical things I checked afterward. The boat's wiring, the radio, the depth finder, the batteries, all worked fine. My phone camera acted up that morning and then behaved normally for the next week. I told a few regulars about it, and a couple of them had odd little things to add. A buoy light that blinked off for a minute 2 nights later, a dog at someone's dock that refused to go near the water for a day. Most shrugged it off. People around here have to live with odd weather, with nets that snag on nothing, with tides that catch fish in places you don't expect. You learn to tuck moments like that into the file marked one of those things, because it's easier than turning your life into a question mark. I ran the inlet again the next morning at first light. The water behaved exactly as it should. The fish bit, the gulls argued, the depth finder sang its usual high-low notes. I didn't sleep much that night. I don't sleep much when I've seen something I can't fold into a routine. But I went out the next day and the next, because you have to get on with things. The boat has to be checked, the lines mended, the bills paid. You don't get to stop because the sky did something. So that's what happened. 3 white points rose from the water at dawn, clean and quiet. They moved into the clouds, and we were left with no explanation. I made it back to shore. I filed the logs the way they want them filed. I fixed the busted bulb on the dock light that afternoon, and I checked my radio again and again. The inlet looks the same as it ever did when you drive past on your way into town. But Time to time, when the fog sits low and bands like a curtain close to the surface, I find myself standing with my hands on the rail, hoping I'll see a small bright shape break the water and climb into the clouds. I never have. I found the Polaroid on a Wednesday morning in early spring. It wasn't in an envelope, just tucked into my mailbox between a grocery flyer and the water bill. At first I thought it was some old photo someone had dropped by mistake. It was a picture of my bedroom, taken at night from the angle of the door. I was in bed, on my side, my hair messy, blankets pulled halfway down. The timestamp at the bottom said 2:43 a.m., and standing around the bed were 3 figures. They weren't sharp in the photo, blurred, like the shutter had caught them mid-movement. Taller than me, narrow-shouldered, their faces pale ovals with no features I could make out. I stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out if it was some prank. My first thought was that one of my friends had broken in and staged it, but the more I studied it, the more wrong it looked. The figures didn't look like people in costumes. They looked thinner, like they didn't fit the space right. I live alone. No roommates, no family in the house, just me in a small single-story place on the edge of town. I hadn't had anyone over that week. I left the Polaroid on the counter and went through my whole house, checking locks, windows, even the attic hatch. Everything was shut, no signs of anyone coming in. When my sister dropped by that afternoon, I showed her the photo. She frowned, said it looked fake. "It's Photoshop, Jamie. Someone's screwing with you." But it wasn't printed on glossy paper. It was a real Polaroid, thick and stiff, with the chemical smell still faint on the back. That night, I didn't sleep much. I left the bedroom light on and kept the TV playing low. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a faint clicking sound like static popping coming from the kitchen. I froze in bed, listening. After about a minute, it stopped. The next morning, another Polaroid was in my mailbox. This one was closer up. My face in bed, eyes closed, the angle looking straight down at me. No timestamp this time, just me sleeping, nothing else. I called the police after that. They sent an officer who walked through, checked the locks, made notes. He said it was probably a trespasser pulling a sick joke. He told me to install cameras and call if I saw anything again. So I bought a couple cheap Wi-Fi cameras and set them up, one in the bedroom, one covering the hallway. That night, I went to bed early, determined to catch whoever was doing it. At some point after midnight, I drifted off. I woke up around 5:30 to my alarm and immediately checked my phone feed. The cameras had both cut out at 2:41 a.m. The files for that half hour were corrupted, just static when I tried to play them, and in my mailbox, waiting, was another Polaroid. This one showed the inside of my bedroom, same as before, but the door was open wider. The 3 blurred figures were back. One was closer to the bed this time, its head tilted like it was looking right at me. I called the police again. Same officer came out, looked annoyed. "If there's no forced entry, there's not much we can do." I asked about the cameras cutting out, and he shrugged. "Cheap Wi-Fi cams drop all the time." I stopped mentioning the figures to him. I could tell he didn't believe me. Over the next week, more photos came. Not every night, but every few days, always around the same time. Always me in bed, sometimes with the figures there, sometimes just me alone. The strangest one was the 6th. It showed me sitting up in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the camera. I don't remember doing that. I asked my sister if she could stay over one night just to see if anything happened while someone else was in the house. She agreed, even though she thought I was overreacting. She slept on the couch, and I forced myself to try to rest in the bedroom. In the morning, there was no Polaroid in the mailbox. For the first time in over a week, nothing. But when I asked my sister how she slept, she gave me a blank look. I don't remember. I lay down, then I was waking up. She swore she didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but later that afternoon, she admitted something had felt off. She said she had this sense when she woke up that something had been reset, like she'd lost time. 2 nights later, another Polaroid showed up. This one wasn't from the angle of the bedroom door. It was from outside the house, looking in through the bedroom window. The curtains were open a crack. You could see me in bed and one of the figures standing right next to me. That night, I nailed the windows shut and pushed a dresser against the bedroom door. I didn't sleep at all. At 2:40 a.m., I felt the bed dip slightly, like someone had leaned on it. My whole body went rigid. The air felt heavy, buzzing faintly in my ears. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. I don't know how long it lasted. At some point, the pressure lifted, and I shot upright, gasping. The clock read 3:12. The dresser was still against the door. Everything was locked. In the morning, there was no Polaroid. That was 3 months ago. I haven't found another picture since. The mailbox has been empty except for bills and junk mail. But sometimes, waking up in the dark, I get the sense that someone has just stepped back from the bed, like the air shifts, like weight leaving a mattress. And every once in a while, I'll catch myself glancing at the mailbox, half expecting to see another square of white tucked inside.